Welcome everyone to the 2026 virtual Oak Wilt Managers meeting. This is kind of the second in a series of meetings that we're hoping to continue on into the future, building off of our 2024 in-person Oak Wilt Managers meeting. Our goal is to have that in-person meeting every third year and fill in the gaps with a virtual meeting. So I'm glad that everybody could make it. Uh, and again, I'm Rob Cole with the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation. I'm a forester here and run our Oak Wilt program, and I'm part of what we call, I guess, the Oak Wilt Planning Committee, the managers meeting committee. So this meeting was planned by myself with the assistance of James Jacobs, Simeon Wright, Heidi Free, Brian Schwingle, Tom Macy, and Rachel Doobie. And that's your Oak Wilt kind of planning committee. So in the future, if you want to be involved in speaking at any of these meetings or you have any ideas, reach out to any one of those folks. We're kind of spread around, so hopefully one or two of those names sounded familiar to you. Just feel free to reach out and yeah, we'll try to, we want to include anyone and everyone who's out there managing Oak Wilt to share, experiences, knowledge, the latest research, etc. So as we move forward in the meeting, hopefully everybody saw the agenda. We're going to start off with some survey and management updates from states, provinces, um, tribal nations, some local government agencies. So we have a pretty well-rounded kind of management section for you there. And then later on, we're going to move into what's going on, the latest research out there for Oak Wilt. So like I think I've said, we have, a pretty tight packed agenda. So we are going to be moderating the sessions to try to keep ourselves on track as much as possible. I'm going to have help with that from Jess Cancelleri and Chris Johnston. And for each block, the speaker is going to present. And if they talk for their entire scheduled time, then we won't have time for live questions, but we've asked the presenters to be prepared to answer questions in the chat. If there's time for questions to be read aloud, either Jess or Chris will read the questions aloud for the presenter to answer during that time period, and then we'll move on to the next speaker when their time slot starts. So hopefully that's clear. I do have, we have a break scheduled for 11 and then a 30-minute break scheduled for 12:30. So we won't be going straight through. Hopefully it's digestible for everyone and not too much information all at once. The meeting will be recorded. It is being recorded right now, so that will be available afterward. It'll go to everyone who has attended today, and then if you have a colleague who was unable to attend today, you'll be able to share the link with them so that we can pass all the information around so we can all be advancing Oak Wilt management and science together in a positive direction for the future. So I think that's all the housekeeping that I have here. During the breaks, the meeting will stay on. You don't have to log out and log back in. So that should be that. Okay, so our first speaker coming up here is Ryan Crandall. He's a forest health specialist with the New Hampshire Division of Forests and Lands. Take it away, Ryan.
Great. Thank you, Rob. Let me get this up on the screen. All right. So my name is Ryan Crandall. I'm a forest health specialist with the New Hampshire Division of Forests and Lands, and I'll be giving an update on our oak wilt monitoring program. So to start off, here in New England and in New Hampshire, we don't have any detections of oak wilt yet. You can see here on the county level detection map. So again, our program focuses on early detection of oak wilt. And so most of that is survey work. So we have an aerial or an annual aerial survey that we conduct. We also have ground surveys in high-risk areas like campgrounds and log mills looking for potentially symptomatic trees. In addition to that, we have a sap beetle trapping program. Again, this is focusing on campgrounds and lumber mills. Traps are baited with the two nitidulid pheromones, the C. sei and C. truncatus pheromones, as well as a fermenting lure. And those sap beetles that we collect are identified and then sent to a diagnostic lab to see whether or not they have any Brezziella phagocerum DNA on them. And from 2022 to 2025, trapping years, we haven't had any positive hits for Brezziella phagocerum DNA on those beetles. In 2023, we did have a false positive that kind of was a bit of an interesting story that I'll describe to you now. So we had sent in some beetles and we had some potential positives on the gel. And so what you can see here in the green box is the positive control. So that's pure Brezziella phagocerum DNA. That red line is the 347 base pair length line. And what you can see is there's some of these beetle samples that appear to be positive. The yellow box in particular is what I'm highlighting. From the gel, from these presumed positives, the next step is to then sequence that DNA to confirm whether or not that is a true positive and has Brezziella phagocerum DNA. Unfortunately, we were not able to get that DNA to sequence. It wasn't high enough quality. And so for a little while, we were kind of operating, going into our next field season, thinking that, okay, we need to look at this site a bit more closely. Luckily, we had some beetles saved in our freezer from that same site and sample period, and so we sent that in to get tested. They came back with these, presumed positives on the gel, but luckily that DNA was high enough quality where we were able to get sequences back and confirm that it was not a true positive. There was no Brezziella phagocerum DNA on those beetles, but it did show us that there were several different species of fungi that have similar enough base pair lengths where they can appear to be positive on a gel. And so we wrote up a short communication paper about that, which I think is important to let folks like myself know, people who don't have oak wilt in the state and may run into something like this. So you can see I've highlighted a couple of these fungal species with a red asterisk. Those are some that have been found on nitidulids in other studies. And in the few years that we've done this sampling, we've found this list of fungi pretty much every single year on these nitidulids. So they're common fungi on these nitidulids. So if you can save some extra beetles from each of your sampling periods, if you do nitidulid trapping, just to have backups if the DNA isn't high enough quality to get sequencing. So now we're going to shift focus to a separate trapping program that's unrelated to our normal oak wilt monitoring. This is a U.S. Forest Service Patho EDRR pilot program. So this is kind of adding a piece onto the early detection rapid response trapping program, looking for invasive species of insects. And so this patho piece is using a spore trap along with the insect traps for the regular early detection rapid response program to look for tree pathogens. We participated in that program in 2024 and 2025, and we had some interesting results. So I'll get into that. So for both summers that we had these spore traps out, we actually found Brezziella phagocerum DNA on those spore traps. And what's interesting is that these spore traps weren't, it wasn't like a pocket in one corner of the state. They're spread all over the state. So this is a wide-ranging, from southern New Hampshire all the way up to northern New Hampshire. We've had these positive IDs. And in northern New Hampshire, if you're unfamiliar with that area, this is an area that oak is pretty rare in. It's really much more of a northern hardwood and conifer forest. So I guess what I'm saying is it seems like there could be some DNA floating around in the atmosphere, potentially coming in from further away. To kind of back that up, So we've had these spore trap positives. In some of those sites, we also had nididulid traps where we collected nididulid beetles, tested them, and the beetles came back negative. So far, it's just been DNA detections from these spore traps. And so interpreting these spore traps has been a little um, interesting, but essentially DNA detections don't necessarily mean that there's an infected tree nearby. Spores could be traveling longer distances. And then there's a question of, are those spores viable when they land? And where do they land? Are they actually landing on a fresh wound on an oak tree? And is the inoculum load um, enough where they could actually infect a tree? So in short, there's a lot of things that would have to go perfectly right in order to have something land on a tree and cause um, an infection. But what now? We have these DNA positives. What are we doing? So essentially, it's additional trapping and survey. So at some of these sites, we've gone back, we've done more beetle trapping, as well as aerial and drone surveys looking for potentially infected trees, and then ground truthing those trees. And to quickly summarize the 2024 field season, following up, or rather the 2025 field season following up on the spore trap positives in 2024. We didn't detect any positive beetles, and we didn't find any symptomatic trees. There were some trees that we were able to ground truth, but they were not dying from oak wilt. It was other unrelated stressors. So in summary, we haven't detected any oak wilt symptomatic trees in New Hampshire. We have not found any Brachyella phagocerum DNA on sap beetles, but we do have these 6 widely separated spore traps where we have detected some Brachyella DNA. So going forward into our 2026 field season, we'll be doing some follow-up work with these 2025 spore trap positives, and that's going to mainly focus on aerial survey, some drone survey, and ground truthing of any potentially symptomatic trees. And so with that, I will break for questions.
Okay, we have a couple questions. So Ryan, Julie asks, how many labs perform DNA sequencing on positive BF samples?
So I don't know the total number of labs that do that, but for us, we used Cornell as well as the UNH or the University of New Hampshire Hubbard Center for Genome Studies.
Great. And we have Cornell here in New York, correct?
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
the next, yes. The next question is, which molecular assay did you use for BFAG DNA from beetles and spore trap surfaces?
So this, I'd have to get back on the methods used for the spore traps. For the beetles, we used the paper out of New York with the DC and Cornell, the McLaughlin et al. I believe 2022 protocol.
Yeah. Is is Karen on? Could she potentially answer that question? Well, if you are Karen, maybe put it in the chat. Okay, so we'll move on for now. We'll try to get back to that question for you. The last question is, what months are you doing the spore survey work?
So the spore survey work overlaps with the regular trapping for early detection rapid response. So that's from about May through to um, early June, or sorry, early July.
Okay, and Emma's asking if you can repeat what you said about the spore traps and the spore viability, if you were able to determine if those spores were viable or not.
Yeah, so we weren't able to determine that, and we don't even know if they were spores we detected. It was just DNA hits. And so that was really just a question of, if there are spores in the upper atmosphere, they're not necessarily viable. They're being blasted with UV radiation and they're potentially traveling for days up in the atmosphere. So it was more or less a question of whether or not there'd even be viable spores that could get onto a tree.
Okay, thank you. And one more quick question. Were the positive spore traps collected in early season?
Yeah, so they're collected every 2 weeks from that early season of May through to the end of early July. Yeah.
Great. Thanks, Ryan. It's 9:50 now, so we're gonna I think Karen's gonna be able to respond to the question about the assay in the chat. So please just monitor the chat and we'll move on
Hey,
to New
thank you.
York. Thanks, Ryan.
Yep, awesome. So up next we have Christopher Johnston, forester with the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation.
Thank you, Rob, and thank you, Ryan. That was a really interesting presentation. My name is Chris Johnston, and I am here with the DEC. I started as a forester back in October, so I'm super excited to be here today. This is kind of my first real oak wilt type of meeting, so I'm really excited to hear from the other states and the other areas and give you guys a little bit of background on what happened with us this past year. So jumping into it. So a little bit of background for anybody else that is new like myself. Oak wilt was first discovered here in New York in the town of Glenville in Schenectady County, which is the top right area of that map. That's kind of near Albany, back in 2008. And from that time until 2024, we have had 3 areas in New York where we have detected oak wilt. Those are distinct areas here in New York compared to other areas. We don't have continuous oak wilt infections on the landscape. There are these areas in the capital region in the town of Glenville, down in Long Island / New York City in our metropolitan area, as well as out west in the Finger Lakes region near Canandaigua Lake. And as of 2024, what I'm showing you in this map is we had 3 active quarantines, meaning we weren't allowing movement of oak wood outside of those areas, and those occurred near our Canandaigua Lake site, as well as the one in the original infection near Glenville. And in terms of our management strategy here in New York, we kind of use our aerial surveys over these targeted areas combined with ground surveys of different public reports and just general ground surveys in general. And what I'm showing you here in this map is that on top of our complete statewide general forest health surveys, where we do fly the entire state, we also fly these more targeted areas over where we've had oak wilt in the past. And we do these in helicopters at lower elevations so that we can better look for potentially symptomatic oak trees. And here what I'm showing you is that in addition to some of our previously infected areas this past year, we also flew near Ontario, Canada, out in our Niagara County in response to their more recent infections. So this is what we did in 2025. We went out and we visited 83 trees across the state that were potentially symptomatic for oak wilt. These were sourced from our July aerial surveys, public reports, and various ground surveys. And a lot of the dots in black were the result of this very wet spring that's led to a significant number of other pathogens. We had a lot of Visconioxia, armillaria root rot, a ton of anthracnose on our white oaks, which led us to go out and visit visit those potentially symptomatic trees and realize that they weren't oak wilt, so we didn't have to sample those ones. But the ones that we did sample, we sampled 22 trees from across the state, and we sent them over to Cornell University Plant Disease Diagnostic Clinic. And this year we were able to actually do branch and leaf sampling at most of these sites, which was really cool. We adopted the petiole testing from the Michigan State protocols, and Cornell was super helpful in being able to test our samples that way. And overall, from those samples, we found 8 positive trees across 7 sites in New York. However, all of those trees came from our Finger Lakes area infection. And in terms of what's been going on there out near Canandaigua Lake, in general, we have seen the southward expansion of oak wilt near the lake, particularly so this past year in 2025, which you can see in the circles in blue in that map. 3 of the infections from 2025 occurred on state land, specifically our High Tor Wildlife Management Area, or WMA, which was interesting because it posed this unique management challenge due to the presence of the endangered northern long-eared bat. So basically, we had, in order to either sample a tree or cut it down in general, we had to have staff go out there and make sure that there weren't any bats roosting, which was a interesting time, but luckily for us, there were not any bats roosting in trees we needed to sample, so that was a good thing. In terms of our management method at most of these sites, this was single tree removal. So again, like I said before, we only had 8 positive trees. So at most sites, we were only removing the infected tree. But in terms of all the sites where any trees that we removed, we then chipped and burned them, and we treated the cut stumps with herbicide. And on this map, you see our previous quarantines, those red areas. This past year, we had to expand those quarantines due to our new infections we found in 2025. So we expanded the 2 previous quarantines and actually merged them into one singular larger quarantine, now spanning 5 towns with 10 active infection centers. And by active, we mean infection centers where it has happened in the past 5 years. So I just want to show this one site out of the 7 sites because this is probably our most unique one. This was at High Tour WMA in Naples on the west side of Canandaigua Lake, which is now our most southern infection out there. And this site was actually discovered by DEC staff. It was not discovered by our aerial surveying efforts because it was outside of our aerial survey lines with our helicopter. So we had a wildlife staff member who was actually an oak wilt technician before, thankfully, and he went out and he discovered these 2 suspicious trees near a skid trail of a timber sale at High Tor. And we immediately tested those trees, and one of the 2 trees came back positive for oak wilt. And when we looked at the site history and what had been going on there, we were kind of able to deduce that this wounding that occurred on this tree, which we were able to see, likely occurred in late March, which led us to change our guidelines in terms of when we allow loggers and workers out onto state lands. We've now pushed that date back to February 28th, so we don't have any overlap with the Nitidula beetles. And the issue here is that when we went out and walked the rest of the sale area, further scouting discovered that there was a ton of oaks that looked like our positive oak. So that scared us a bit because it was outside of our aerial survey lines, and we were wondering, could this be oak wilt on a greater scale here in New York? We found 30 trees that were suspicious for it. So we worked quickly, we treated all as being positive for the disease, and we sampled all of the red oaks, sent them into Cornell. And thankfully, all those additional oaks tested negative for the disease. And further examination of the site found that there were a bunch of site characteristics, like there was this big 2-line chestnut borer outbreak, there had been drought at the site, there was spongy moth infestation. It was just generally a bad site for these oaks to occur on at the moment, so there was a lot of mortality there. So some takeaways from Canandaigua Lake. Overall, what we need to understand is that oak wilt has been present in some capacity here since 2016. And we need these yearly aerial surveys to continue to try to fight this battle against oak wilt in this region. While we consider that we eradicate each site that we find, we keep finding new sites, so we need to keep our efforts in this area so we can hopefully be successful in removing the disease there. And 4 out of the 7 sites in 2025 had evidence of pruning or mechanical damage. So with this regard, you can see that in the pictures there. We need better outreach regarding our best management practices in this area specifically. We will also look to expand our aerial surveying efforts in this area. As I mentioned before, actually 2 of the sites we found this past year were outside of where we were doing our helicopter surveys. So we want to make sure we're getting as best coverage as we can. Now, in other news, we get good news from the other side of the state. 2025 marked our 7th year of aerial surveying efforts without a positive detection in the town of Glenville, meaning that we lifted the quarantine from New York's original infection center. This means that our only active quarantine is the one I was just talking about prior. And while we have lifted the quarantine in Glenville, we will still continue our monitoring efforts in that area for multiple years through aerial surveys and ground surveys. And in terms of what we're looking to do this coming year, we want to increase our aerial surveying efforts specifically in Western New York. Like I mentioned, we want to get greater Finger Lakes coverage. We want to increase our survey lines or flight paths near Niagara and Erie County, near the Ontario reported infections. And we want to start getting better coverage of southwestern New York, where we do have infections on the other side of the Pennsylvania border. And we want to continue our Nitidulid sampling as an early detection tool. I didn't talk about it in this presentation because I'm a bit pressed for time, but we did have some sampling go on in Niagara County up near Ontario, Canada. And while we haven't gotten all of those results back yet, they have been all negative so far, so that's a good thing. And in terms of research moving forward, we want to look at our different vectors. So we want to look at the species that are visiting wounds on oaks in New York. And I'm not actually going to dive into this because Erica Colbert has a wonderful presentation later that is going to talk about that. But we also are bouncing around this idea of looking at root grafting in New York because we've kind of had more of a rare situation, it appears here, where it appears that we haven't had maybe as much root grafting as other states. So with that, I just want to thank everyone involved. Like I mentioned before, it's my first year really doing an oak wilt season, and everybody that I worked with made it absolutely wonderful. This was a huge task. 7 infected sites was the biggest we ever had, or tied for the biggest we ever had in New York. So I really, really, really appreciate everyone and all their efforts out there, and thank you all for listening.
Thanks, Chris. That was awesome. If you don't mind, you have several questions, but I think we need to move on. So if you don't mind, I can do one. All right. Well, the first one's pretty straightforward. What herbicide are you treating the stumps with?
So this past year, we actually used a mixture. We use glyphosate, but in the future, I believe we're going to be using triclopyr. We did use triclopyr because we ran out of glyphosate. Yeah, I just spoke with a Region 8 member yesterday, and I think we're going to be using triclopyr going forward.
Awesome. All right. Yeah, please take a look at the chat, and anyone else from DEC that might want to chime in that's been involved in oak wilt is welcome to do so as well.
All right, very good. Thank you, Chris. Up next, we have Jill Rose, who's a forest pathologist with the Pennsylvania Department of Conservation and Natural Resources. Take it away.
Help if I take myself off mute. Okay. Mine's not going to be long because I don't have anything really new and exciting, but excuse me, I'll just kind of go over a few things that's happened in our state over the past few years. Some of this I covered much more in depth in 2024 when we met, but let's see, let's get this thing in. There we go. Okay, so this is the current distribution of oak wilt in Pennsylvania. It has not been detected east of the Susquehanna. There was a map earlier showing Berks County as positive. I know in 2021, Davy Tree Company had called me and said they had gotten some positives. I think it was around the Philly, Montgomery, and Delaware counties, showing, they had positives for oak wilt. They had sent these samples to a lab in Texas, but apparently this lab generated a fair amount of false positives that year. I wish I had an opportunity to test those samples, but what I had done is I followed up a few weeks later, taking a look at things, and I'm like, this isn't oak wilt. And I came back the next year and confirmed, like, wow, these red oaks are still alive. This is definitely not oak wilt. And like I said, it did turn out to be false positives, but I think in reporting at the time, it got out that, oh, we have positives now east of the Susquehanna, but that is not correct. As you can see here, it's, I started with the Bureau in 2019 and basically got rolled into oak wilt extravaganza in 2020. We had a fair amount of areas popping up in north central PA. And there was the Stone Valley Experimental Forest, Penn State's Experimental Forest in Center County was having issues with oak wilt. So it led us to collaborate with them on a project that we decided to, basically just like, hey, let's just test, borrowing from the playbook from the Midwest. Let's look at herbicide application methods within stand level mitigation. We refined and validated sacrificial buffer distance prescriptions for herbicide mitigation, for Pennsylvania forests. We also looked at effectiveness of oak wilt wood disposal methods. And then that really, for us, out of that led to a development of oak wilt recommendations for Pennsylvania. Again, we leaned on some folks from the Midwest, and we tried to come up with realistic options for our foresters in particular on the districts. We tried to give we ranked actions as far as given a scenario, there's different scenarios. These are just some excerpts. And, what is the minimal you can do? It's better than nothing. And this is also, in combination with the results we got from our wood disposal study, the whole way up to you've got everything you need, all the tools, all the people, all the time to go in ideally and deal with it. So we look at things like what's not part of the timber sale, because they may be a little different in our approach on trees that will be part of the timber sale. And like I said, there we break it down into even single trees, homeowners, have a tree in their backyard kind of thing. And so as far as disposal, disposal movement recommendations, again, we tried to break things down to minimal, moderate, and ideal, because we just want to present options out there for people. Because if we just put an ideal situation out there, a lot of people are like, well, we can't do that. So we try to get something out there. And then again, we came up with, I think, 5 or 6 scenarios, of what you might want to, how you might want to approach a situation. So anyway, this document's generated, it's an in-house document basically for our foresters on the districts, and how they can go about things. We as far as we tried now, like I said, things have really slowed down as far as oak wilt positives. I think we had maybe 2 in 2024. There were no new positives in 2025. I feel like because we have so much oak decline, I think that's more of our issue right now. I mean, we got trees dying right and left, and obviously oak wilt's not gonna, impact trees that are on their way out. But at the same time, like I said, we're just trying to, I think at this point, just to remain, it's established, but it's manageable. But we just got to continue to be vigilant for new areas of spread or expansion in previously detected areas. And, if anything does show up, we just got to be aggressive with pocket management. And like I said, apply guidance to our foresters as scenarios pop up, because of course, we have this document, we try to capture different scenarios that we could think of at the time, but as you know, new scenarios pop up all the time for various things. So yeah, that's basically all I have.
All right, thanks, Jill. We do have a couple questions. The first, I think you may have addressed after they asked it, but are the management recommendations available online?
Unfortunately, they are not. Right now, we had to go through, oh my God, it took months for just an in-house approval, and we just wanted to get them out the door. So we're like, God, we can't imagine how long it would take if it was something we could put out to the public. But what we're going to try to do is just get something pared down and put online for the public.
All right, thanks. The next question is, I noticed your positives were along a waterway. Could a waterway represent a corridor for spore or beetle travel? And could the scents that attract the beetle be more intense or travel farther along waterways?
That's a good question. I honestly, I can't answer that. Somebody that has had maybe more years of experience in their pocket maybe be able to give an answer to that, but I honestly, I can't answer that.
All right, thanks. I think those are all the questions for now. Anybody else? We have 1 minute left.
I just noticed.
Calvin,
I was
sorry,
just
go
going to say, I
ahead.
noticed, yeah, that Calvin mentioned
Yeah.
that there was also a power line there. I don't know if you want to address that more. Yeah. trimming
Yeah,
may have
he
damaged
could be,
trees.
that could be how, it definitely ticked up along that power line. I forgot about that. I was actually, Calvin and I were working on, this project together, and yeah, I mean, that power line work could have definitely contributed, giving the appearance of the waterway movement.
Yeah, and Bryce also says wind could affect trees more along waterways.
True, true.
Good point. One more question. I noticed a different Latin name for the fungus on one of the earlier slides. Is that a different variety? Or did someone just use like the old oak wilt name?
I'm gonna guess. Oh, I did. Yeah, it should be Bretziella. I had Ceratocystis. Yeah, that my bad. But yeah, it's just the old name that I used.
Great. And Dave Mozell says, really great work, everyone. We found in Wisconsin a high frequency of overland spread due to limbs out and spring windstorms. So have made recommendations. You're using a lot of abbreviations here, Dave. You're not making this easy. So we've made recommendations to silviculture and timber markets to consider trees with weak crotches at high risk. Also consider wider oak spacing and pre-commercial thinning or commercial thinning crop tree release selection to minimize grafting. Not sure how effective it is, but makes sense to us. Nice. And I think that's all. Thanks, Jill.
Yeah, awesome. Great.
Yeah, great. Thank you.
All right, very good. So we're keeping right on track here by the looks of it. So next we have Julie Holmes, who's a plant health survey biologist for the Ontario area, and she works for the Canadian Food Inspection Agency. Welcome, Julie.
Thank you very much. I'm really excited to be here providing you with an update on the oak wilt situation in Ontario this year. And everyone can see my screen okay?
Yep.
Perfect. Okay. All right, so just to familiarize everyone, there were 3 localized populations of oak wilt identified within Southern Ontario in 2023. So the first being the find in Niagara Falls, which represented the first Canadian record of oak wilt. And then we were alerted to this find in May by an arborist who was suspicious of bark cracking on 3 standing dead oak trees at a private residence. And then within the span of a week or two, a second report came from a homeowner in the township of Springwater who was concerned about bronzing and crown decline on their single red oak, which was then confirmed positive by CFIA. And then finally, we received a third report about 5 kilometers from the initial infestation from a field practitioner concerned about bronzing and crown dieback again on a single oak, which was again confirmed positive by CFIA. So all in about a span of a month, we had 3 isolated finds of oak wilt, which was a first for Canada. So in response to these fines, CFIA initiated regulatory controls, restricting the movement of any host material off the sites, and that would give us a chance to determine the extent of the infestations. So we completed visual surveys within a 400-meter radius of each positive site, where our inspectors visually assessed all species of oak for signs and symptoms of oak wilt, and then any symptomatic material was then sampled and sent to our pathology lab for analysis. Physical controls were applied then at each site through tree removals. So in addition to positive trees, we also ordered the removal of healthy trees falling within the control zones. So in all, about 16 trees were removed across the 3 sites. And then as a result of our increased outreach efforts during that time, both ours as well as our partners, there was also an increase of oak wilt reports from the public, which then further assisted in our response. And throughout this response period, we utilized partnerships and the available technical expertise to ensure that current science, as well as lessons learned from our US counterparts, were guiding our response process. So luckily for us, we had an oak wilt technical advisory committee established well in advance of the 2023 fines. So the goal of this group was to coordinate a multi-government information sharing network and prepare for the arrival of oak wilt in Canada, given its close proximity to the Canadian border. So the TAC worked collaboratively with other contributors to develop that response framework, which outlines comprehensive measures for response to the pest. And this also draws on the collective experience of a multitude of organizations and partners. So this includes Michigan as well as New York State, who have obviously dealt with the pest firsthand. So this was an invaluable resource to us, and we used that to guide the response process. And it enabled us to move forward with an effective and coordinated response in a relatively quick manner. And of course, during the response itself, partnerships were crucial, from working with municipalities to complete the removals, field practitioners and members of the public who reported suspect finds, and partners who provided science advice, shared surveillance data, and promoted oak wilt awareness through their respective networks. So this certainly wouldn't have been done as effectively without the many levels of collaboration that took place. So the next several slides will outline the various aspects of our ongoing response activities, including the regulatory tools that we have, surveillance, and of course, pest reports and outreach. So oak wilt is designated as a regulated plant pest under the Plant Protection Act and regulations. So this allows us to implement import requirements on high-risk regulated materials, so preventing the entry of the pest into Canada. And then under this authority, there is also several domestic tools that we have to prevent the potential movement within Canada. So for example, under Section 5 of the Act, so anyone who becomes aware of a regulated plant pest in an area where it's not known to occur is required by law to notify the CFIA. And then we have the authority to carry out plant pest surveys and verify all suspect reports on both public and privately owned lands. So this allows us to enter onto properties and collect samples as needed. And then if oak wilt is confirmed on a property, we have the authority to place regulatory controls either at the site level using a notice of prohibition of movement, or on a broader scale through a ministerial order to prevent the movement of potentially infested host material, either from that property or out of a larger defined boundary without written permission from the CFIA. So next, I'm going to provide you with an overview of our surveillance program. So I've broken that down into delimitation and detection surveys. So our annual delimitation surveys were initiated in the year following the application of the controls at each site. And this was done to obviously verify the efficacy of our control efforts. So delimitation surveys, they're carried out within a 1.6 kilometer radius of the infection center, and it's done at kind of varying levels of intensity in relation to the initial finds. So trees nearest to the infection center are at highest risk. So all species within a 100-meter radius of the infested sites are visually assessed each year. And then as we move further away from that initial infection center, we then prioritize inspection of species in the red oak group, and then we alternate quadrants every other year. And then oak wilt is considered to be under eradication in Canada. So these delimitation surveys will be ongoing at each site until we're able to obtain 5 consecutive years of negative survey data. Before then, we would consider declaring eradication. So as a complement to the delimitation surveys, we're also continuing to complete our annual detection surveys, and these are done across the broader landscape of Eastern Canada to monitor for new populations of the pest. So we focus on high-risk pathways of introduction of the pest where oak wilt may have been introduced through human-mediated means. So examples are campgrounds and mills importing oak logs from infested U.S. states. And then we also incorporate sites where positive signals have been identified through the provincial eDNA trapping work that's being completed by Sharon Reed. And then surveys will take place between July and mid-August, where inspectors make stand level assessments for pockets of decline before visually inspecting 50 red oak trees for signs and symptoms of oak wilt. Again, sampling any suspect material. So in 2025, we completed surveys at 129 sites across Eastern Canada, 104 of which fall within Ontario. And the good news is we had no new detections of oak wilt. So now we've obtained our second year of negative survey data, again, with the goal of 5 consecutive years for eradication. So the CFIA receives hundreds of reports each year for the many pests that we regulate, and then we review and respond to all reports, and SMEs or subject matter experts will triage those that might require an on-site visit from inspection staff, either to collect samples or complete a visual survey to rule out pests such as oak wilt. So I've included a snapshot of our dashboard. This just shows the oak wilt reports for the current year, in addition to examples of some photos here that we've received through previous reports. So the majority of the reports that we receive do turn out to be negative for oak wilt, but as you can see from the photos there on the left, some are definitely more concerning than others. So I've included a photo in the middle here just showing the bark cracking noted on one of the dead standing trees at that initial positive site in Niagara Falls. And then we have a reporting function set up through our public website, in addition to direct email accounts so that individuals can reach out to us to provide their reports. We also have mechanisms in place to monitor data collected through apps like EdMaps and iNaturalist. So for example, through our AI lab, we've established a daily email alert that provides us with a summary of observations entered into iNaturalist. So this pulls specific pests based on a pre-established watch list. And then we're scanning these reports on a daily basis, which further enhances our capacity to respond to sightings of concern and kind of in real time as they're reported. So outreach and education obviously plays a critical role in facilitating stakeholder and community awareness, and this will foster cooperation in reporting suspects and also when they're in place, observing movement restrictions. So this includes providing training and hands-on workshops for field practitioners and educating other stakeholders and members of the public on oak wilt signs and symptoms, movement restrictions and the risks associated with the movement of firewood, educating on risk periods to encourage pruning between November 1st and March 31st of each year, where to go to access oak wilt resources, and of course, how to report a suspect find. So all 3 oak wilt finds in Canada can be attributed to pest reports from members of the public, as well as field practitioners who had some level of awareness of the pest. So this really does demonstrate that outreach is a key component of early detection and rapid response for this pest. So to complement our outreach efforts, we have a number of resources that are available. Our survey protocol for oak wilt can be accessed online, as well as the framework as well on our website. And we also have the ability to collect partner data through the use of Esri's Survey 123 app. And then we've also developed things like pest and information cards to highlight oak wilt identification and pest reporting processes. And we have numerous other web-based resources that can be accessed on our external website. So with that, it's kind of quick, but I'm happy to take any questions. You're also more than welcome to me to reach out after the session. And yeah, thank you very much for the invitation to speak today.
All right, thanks so much, Julie. We have one question so far, and that's, can you repeat how you pull the iNaturalist observations?
Sure, yeah. So there's some AI wizardry that goes on. We have a specific AI lab within the CFIA. So we've established a watch list with a number of species on there just to say, like, these are the ones that we're looking out for. They're like regulated pests or pests of interest. And then there's an algorithm that mines that iNaturalist project and then provides those report summaries for us. And we get them in our email. So it's usually like a 1 or 2 day lag from reporting.
Wow, that's pretty cool that you have an AI lab.
I know, it's fantastic.
We're not even allowed to use it.
Oh, okay.
I know.
That's unfortunate. It's a really great resource, and we have had not of oak wilt, but we have had regulated pest finds in new areas based on iNaturalist reports. So it is effective.
Amazing. There's one more quick question I think we can get to. Why do you conclude the surveying in mid-August?
We typically try to sample in mid-August. So we're surveying in July and August. Typically, that's when the signs and symptoms are going to be most apparent in the field. So we try to concentrate our efforts during those 2 months. And then we want to try to sample August 15th or later just to reduce the risk of sampling during that high risk period.
Okay, great. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
All right, yeah, great. Very good presentation. Up next, we have the Michigan update, and this is going to be a little bit different than the rest because there's going to be a few people in this time slot. So up first will be Simeon Wright, and then Heidi Free and Bree Jasinski, and they all work within Michigan, the state of Michigan, and Bree is with Ottawa County Parks, and Simeon and Heidi are with Michigan DNR. So I'll let Simeon take it from here.
Sorry about that. Looks like I was still muted. Rob, can you see my slides okay?
Yep, looks great.
All right. Well, good morning, everyone. As Rob said, I'm going to provide a brief Michigan State report, including activities by the Michigan DNR Forest Resources Division, where I work, and then Heidi Fry with our separate DNR Parks and Recreation Division, as well as Bree Jasinski with our Ottawa County Parks, will present on their oak wilt perspectives and unique efforts to address the disease here in Michigan.
I think you're
Simeon,
muted.
you muted again, Simeon.
Is it
I
us?
don't know how I did that. Sorry. So what I was trying to say is that I view oak wilt as a success story here in Michigan, um, especially compared to some of the other invasives we work with, given the fact that the disease has been present in our state for more than 75 years. And that's when we first began some trials to manage the disease. So although there are biological reasons for this, our efforts to address oak wilt play a big role in the fact that we still have 600 million oak trees in our forests here. All right, so oak wilt is unfortunately still a particular problem in the sandy oak dominated glacial outwash areas of the northern lake states where many trees can be lost due to underground spread, resulting in mortality pockets that can cover multiple acres. So in Michigan, areas with lots of oak wilt largely mirror the areas with oak abundance, with some exceptions, particularly in Michigan's Upper Peninsula. Our online oak wilt viewer underrepresents oak wilt across the landscape, but does show where the disease is common, as represented by red dots. And 2025 was another active year for oak wilt related efforts. And unfortunately, we continue to find new infections. And of particular note is the Upper Peninsula, further east and north of the areas along the Wisconsin border, where oak wilt has been present for decades. So I've highlighted those locations in the Upper Peninsula there on the map. These are areas that we are prioritizing for our management efforts, although we do manage oak wilt across the state between us and our partners. So addressing oak wilt is a very high priority in Michigan for many partners. And the Oak Wilt Coalition is one way that these partners in the state coordinate their efforts. And the coalition is working on common messaging and best management practices. This is an ongoing challenge to get people with different perspectives on the same page, but this is how we're able to do that. And in addition, there's a rigorous multi-day training that is provided to arborists and other managers with a qualification status that raises the bar on oak wilt management in Michigan. Within the Forest Resources Division where I work, our Forest Health Program team, we have 14 staff. They all assist with our oak wilt related efforts in some way, and the rest of my presentation focuses on their collective efforts. So pockets of oak wilt infection on DNR forest resources and wildlife managed lands are identified in several ways, including aerial surveys and NAPE imagery, as well as ground-based observations. We are interested in drone-based surveys in the future, but we cover such a large area that it hasn't been a viable option for us to date. But all infections that we find are confirmed via spore mat detection or a lab test prior to doing any treatments. We want to make sure that we're being efficient and using funding in a good manner. When we're doing those treatments, we want to ensure that it's actually oak wilt that we're treating. Our preferred method of treatment is the vibratory plow, and we have some suggestion of 90% or better success rate over 5 years of monitoring here in Michigan. At times, it can be difficult to separate some treatment line failure from new overland spread in certain situations, and in other situations, site monitoring can become difficult due to clear cutting or other issues that happen prior to the 5-year mark. We're also trialing a girdle herbicide treatment. I don't have time to get into a lot of detail here today. I know others will be talking about herbicide treatments as well. Our results to date suggest some success, but I will point out that several of the treatments that we've done include trees beyond those the Bruin model would suggest sacrificing. So in other words, we're going out a little bit further with our treatment just to try and ensure success. As it takes time for the root systems to die and oak wilt to move through those root systems, we want to monitor for at least 6 years. So on this table where I have 7 successful treatments at 3 years, that's nowhere near long enough to have any confidence that that treatment is going to be successful in the end. We have had a number of close calls with the girdle herbicide treatments where girdled trees suddenly snap. And while girdle depth and decay pocket assessment is really important when doing this girdling work, we have sites where we're simply not comfortable girdling trees. Consequently, on a couple sites as shown here where we've got large boulders, some of them buried, making it impossible to vibratory plow, and trees with decay pockets, we've begun trialing imazapyr and glyphosate. And these trials just began last year. So we're unsure how well this will work for us, but we hope to optimize a safer treatment method in the future. I also want to point out that both these products, particularly imazapyr, there is some risk of the chemical moving through root systems and injuring or killing adjacent trees that we didn't plan to sacrifice. If this treatment is successful, we can accept some additional mortality on the sites that we're working if it ends up with eradication of the oak wilt pocket. And with that, I just want to also mention that we do have areas where oak wilt is common and we can't justify individual pocket treatments, and do utilize other options such as promoting diversity, as we see here, or site conversion to get away from those impacts of oak wilt. And with that, I'll turn it over to Heidi and Bree to discuss their separate efforts, and we can take questions at the end or in the chat. So thank you very much. I will stop sharing.
Okay, can you guys see my screen and hear me too?
Yep. Looks
Yes.
good.
Okay, good
Sounds
deal. Okay, I'm going to go over oak wilt management within DNR Parks and Recreation Division. And just a quick reference, I'm really glad that Simeon included the statewide map of known oak wilt. I've included a map here of all of our units statewide. These are all areas that you can see in that blue outline that are managed by DNR Parks and Recreation Division. And then the units where we are managing oak wilt this year only, outlined there with these kind of bluish purple dots. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go over some of the challenges that are kind of particular to managing oak wilt in a park system as expansive as ours, and talk about some of the management that we've done, and recognizing that this work is done by our staff statewide. I've included some of those folks, some of our rangers, and then our MCCC Forest Health Program. A couple of units that we'll be mentioning in particular, and hopefully you can see my cursor, but in that Ann Arbor, Detroit area cluster, we'll be talking a little bit about Waterloo. Down here in the southern corner here, that's going to be Warren Dunes. And then just to orient folks up here near the Grand Rapids area, that's going to be PJ Hoffmaster State Park. Just to set the framework here, within Parks and Recreation Division, we manage 360,000 plus acres and 104 parks and recreation areas statewide. These areas are set aside because they represent some significant natural features or cultural features and areas for public recreation. My unit, where I'm housed, is our stewardship unit. We have 15 full-time staff plus 8 to 20 non-career staff, and we're charged with managing the vegetation and doing ecosystem management within state parks aimed at protecting those high value cultural and natural resource systems within our parks. Where we're posed with a really unique challenge is Oak Wilt really loves people. People and Oak Wilt really just seem to go together. And that's kind of this box that we sit in, is managing high quality natural resources and people. This is our first really big hit with Oak Wilt, dating back to 2012 at PJ Hoffmaster State Park. That was introduced at one of our campsites, and that led to the removal of 60 trees. This was done using a standard Brune model, vibratory plowing around that, and then removing all the existing host within there. One thing to point out is that, when it comes to Oak Wilt in a campground and in these areas where we have people, we really have no choice but to manage, because we are managing for hazards and risk all at the same time. And in addition to that, what gives us these additional challenges is this underground infrastructure. A lot of these places are really well developed. And this particular example at Warren Dunes, this is actually one of our older maps. And so when we're trying to do this management, we're also trying to decipher a lot of where that infrastructure sits. You can see these little green blobs. Those are just the positive Oak Wilt detections from this year only. This particular park welcomes about 1.5 million visitors each year, and that included 170,000 campsites. So that translates for us into our income, but locally that adds about $13 million estimated to the local economy. We do get lucky sometimes and get some more updated maps, like this one at North Higgins Lake. But one of the trends that we're seeing is continued development in these areas. This is a scene from management this year at North Higgins Lake, and it's kind of hard to see in the background here. There's a lot of dead trees. That's a power line. We know that power line was pruned in August, and that resulted in, obviously we do have to manage that. Because we can't have a lot of standing dead trees around targets, and we also are out there seeking to protect the resource. Another trend that we're seeing a lot is Oak Wilt stemming from property line and these boundary issues, particularly at some of our units where we are situated with a lot of neighbors. In this case, Waterloo Recreation Area. It's about 21,000 acres. This is the third largest state park. It's also situated around the Ann Arbor, kind of Detroit metro area. So there's a lot more development happening in these areas. This boundary line tree here, this was detected in September. Lots of leaves were on the ground. We received a positive diagnosis from MSU lab just a few days later. In this instance, we really have little options as far as removal of that. This is a contract job, and that ends up costing us a little bit more money, obviously, to do that. So this year, I'm going to just cover a little bit of our vibratory plowing. We typically see a lot of our Oak Wilt within developed areas, and that's starting to change a little bit. This year alone, we managed Oak Wilt in 20 state parks, recreation areas, and state forest campgrounds statewide. That represented over 7,000 hours of work just in the removal of trees, setting up those plow lines, moving debris, burning debris, and so on. So we managed 61 individual zones within Parks and Recreation Division administered lands. That represented 40,000, almost 40,800 feet of line installed. 124 infected trees were removed, and we are actually still out vibratory plowing even today. Our plow season began back in November, and we have been continually plowing throughout the season, moving that plow around the state within our units. I do want to point out here, I've got this little Bob Ross image there. If folks are familiar with the Happy Little 5K, that is our fundraising effort that supports a lot of our work that we do, including the purchase of a vibratory plow with the registrations from that event a few years ago. We had started doing some chemical control using propazole within some of those plow lines, recognizing that a standard Bruin model vibratory plowing and removing all living host within that area was kind of traumatic for some of our campground units. So years ago, we had done some vibratory plowing and then injected trees on the interior. We backed off a little bit just due to capacity issues. And this year we've started to integrate that back in at select sites. So this is a site at PJ Hoffmaster where we've had some chronic issues over the year. And we just really don't want to continue to lose that green infrastructure within our campground settings. We have since 2015, actually 2015 through 2020, done some chemical control using girdling. And really our aim was to simulate the vibratory plow in areas where we could not take that machine. So this would be areas with sensitive ecological systems, areas with cultural concerns, and we're really just going through and setting up that Bruin model and then girdling all living host within that. And I've highlighted our specs here. This is one of our earlier contracts before we moved to doing the work in-house at some of our units. I'm going to run through some of that work that we're continuing to do just visually to show some of the areas where we're doing that. This is PJ Hoffmaster, and you can kind of see that dune formation there. These are areas where it's very difficult to do mechanical control. We had started doing a girdle treatment simulating the Bruin model and recognizing just losing too many trees. So in 2022, we shifted to more of a rapid response. And you can kind of see the progression there of the number of trees that we have girdled individually, just at this park alone. Doing a little bit of that work elsewhere around the state, Warren Dunes, PJ Hoffmaster, Yankee Springs. You can see this image of Yankee Springs here has all of these purple dots. Those are all trees that have been oak wilt positive. Most of those have been girdled. And you can see the summary there of all of the trees statewide that we've girdled within those units this year. So about a little over 5,000 inches in diameter. One thing that I'll talk a little bit more about in a later presentation is integrating drones into our surveillance for oak wilt. And we've done a lot more of that at Yankee Springs. I'll get into that in a later talk. But before I finish up, just a big thanks to all of our staff around the state that assist with this work. I'm going to stop sharing, and I'm happy to hand it over to one of our park neighbors, Ottawa County Parks.
All right, hello everyone. Let me share my screen here really quick. Okay, can everyone see that?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. All right, so I'm just gonna go over really quickly a little bit about Ottawa County Parks. As you can see here, this is the DNR Oak Wilt viewer that Simeon showed earlier. And we're a county park system located where that red arrow is, right along the lake shore. We're actually just south of Hoffmaster State Park, one of our parks is, the park that Heidi just showed quite a bit of oak wilt work at. So we manage over 7,500 acres across the county, over 42 parks. We've done a little bit of oak wilt work in the past, but mostly it's been kind of labor and cost prohibitive for us. So you can see up there that very north area, that's North Ottawa Dunes, just south of Hoffmaster. So we did a little bit of girdle work there in the last 6-10 years. And then this year we kind of went hard and we found it at, known to be at 5 of our other parks. So we're starting to tackle that with a few different methods. So we have my favorite epicenters, which are straightforward epicenters. Usually those only have, a couple trees, 1 to 5 that are dead or flagged. As you can see in the map here, the ones that are in red were flagged. So those are great. We basically just go out and double girdle and herbicide everything within grafting distance. We use 30% of that Garland 4, the triclopyr, and then 70% of a diesel or paraffin oil mixing agent. And hopefully that'll just knock out those epicenters. So it's great great when we have those. This is a much more difficult epicenter at Rosie Mound Natural Area. I wanted to go over this because it kind of shows the difficulty of working within parks. So up in the right-hand corner of that photo, we've got a parking lot, and then this is a trail system that leads out to the lake. And then right smack in the middle, we've got our oak wilt epicenter. And that's probably been there for, I don't know, I'm going to guesstimate a few years at least, maybe up to 5. So what we did this year, we were able to get the DNR's vibratory plow, which was great. So this fall, we did a trenching around the white line there. And then basically now we're dealing with the idea of, we're a park system. We don't have the money to just completely, or the gear and equipment to just completely remove all those trees and chip them. But we're basically going to have trees that are going to act as spore producers as they continue to die within that epicenter. So we decided to do a mixture of fungiciding some high value oaks that are along the trails, and that's in blue there. And so we know we're kind of putting these on a cycle where we're going to be treating them for a while, if not even longer. And then we also decided to do some double girdling on some oaks just inside the trench line, just to give us some even more protection. So in purple there, you can see that's that same epicenter, and we basically girdled all of the trees around the trench line to try to prohibit or stop any potential grafting, regrafting across that trench line in the future. So this is, TBD. We'll see how it goes. And then additional activities, we're also doing some replanting in oak wilt epicenters. We've got a lot of trees dying, but that also means that we can use that as an opportunity to diversify some of the plantings in our parks. We're doing a lot of neighborhood education and outreach. We have really tiny parcel, well, not tiny, but tiny in terms of, a state forest parcels. And so working with neighbors is really important because there's a lot of oak wilt kind of surrounding our parks too. And then we're also doing some planning for some drone surveys. We got approved for a drone in the budget for next year. I think that's all I've got. If you guys have any questions, you can feel free to contact me or Tyler Allen White, supervisor, or Neely Mulhawk, our coordinator. And thank you so much.
Thank you. We have a couple questions. I think some of them have already been addressed in the chat, but there's a couple more. Let me just see. I am curious about how you prioritize where you will be doing your oak wilt management. And also, do you do any prescribed burning in oak wilt infected areas?
Yeah, so we do not do any prescribed burning in oak wilt infected areas yet. We do prescribed burning, but don't have that overlap yet. And then as far as prioritizing, basically we look at all the ones that we have, and the ones that are easiest to get to, we prioritize the single, smaller epicenters, and then also Rosie Mound, some of our more aesthetic, and culturally important areas too.
Okay,
Hey,
great.
Sorry,
Oh,
this is Heidi. Can I jump in and just add a little bit about prescribed burning in oak wilt? Yeah, we burn quite a bit in southern Michigan. Well, we aim to burn to maintain a lot of that oak system. And I'll say that most of the units that we have the biggest issues with oak wilt are those that are burn units that have not been burned. And I don't know, it's just really, I think, a function of just being close to suburban development and some of those other things. We do have one burn unit with that has had some oak wilt issues, and I would attribute that mostly to its proximity to a neighborhood versus anything to do with prescribed fire.
great. Thanks, Heidi. One more question. Again, I think the second one was already addressed. What are you planting?
Yeah, so we're planning on planting some white oak, and also some hickory species, some understory like witch hazel, serviceberry. It kind of depends on the area that we're in.
Okay, great. Sorry, I'm just making sure this is a question. I think I'll just direct everybody to the chat. There's like some subsequent discussion and potentially more questions within that. So let's just turn it over to the chat and we'll move on to the next presentation.
Great. Thank you, Jess. Okay, so next up, the final presentation before our break is Philip T. Marshall, Forest Health Specialist with the Indiana Department of Natural Resources Forestry Division.
All right, everybody, I'm going to be hopefully quick on all of this for you. Just going to give you an overview of where we have oak wilt in Indiana. And if I can move my slide forward. Oops, sorry. Put it back in presentation mode. There you go. This map shows the counties that have oak wilt based on the original history that I inherited the map from 1979. Prior to that, then the counties in green are all confirmed for the first time since 2000. And then counties in red have white years noted in them. That's reconfirmation of oak wilt by the year since 2000. And this year we had reconfirmation up in the northwest there in Porter County, and also over in Elkhart County. That's had reconfirmed for the first time in 24 with Emma Conrad, who's on this presentation, found in there. This year I had a sample out of Sullivan County that we thought could be oak wilt, the first confirmed in there. This is the county many, many years ago that the loggers would always list as all their oaks going export would come out of that county, especially from any logs in southern Indiana. I also had a sample out of Johnson County on Crane Naval Depot. Both of those samples did not turn out to be oak wilt. The one in Sullivan County turned out to be a bacterial leaf scorch. But what I've looked in these counties is the occurrence of oak wilt is within 1 mile of the border. This county up here also, oak wilt is within 1 mile of the county border. So I just update the map based on the counties. One of the more recent years that I've had continued concerns is this county over here. 3 years in a row, basically, that county had new locations there. As far as the management with oak wilt in Indiana, most of the time when you're in southern Indiana, you can't do vibratory plows because it's hilly, rocky. This is unglaciated area. And so down there, a lot of times when it comes to that, it's time for harvest. So I tell the foresters to make the oak wilt spot the clearing, the opening in the forest there, and to give them a quick guide that I've always told them. I say, you take the tree and you use a 2 tree height distance from that tree and you make that your opening, and try also, and I tell them I know it won't happen with the loggers, to try to get the loggers to work on that site, that circular area, and harvest all the trees on the outside circle first and then move inward to take the oak tree that's got infection last. The other thing is this area of the state. This is the old prairie area to some degree. This is the Kankakee River. This is where oak wilt is very common. It's easy to see it all the time in this area. It's a little more difficult over in this side of the state up in the northeast corner and even down through this area. So you get in through the white counties, you're getting into corn and soybeans. So we only have scattered small woodlots there. This county doesn't have any trees to speak of. It's old prairie ground, so I haven't found it there. In fact, I did find it barely in this county a few years ago in some yard trees. So see it in, of course, pin oak. The one up here found in 24, that was northern pin oak. And the other ones are red oak or black oak. So I survey each year for defoliation, so I'll look for the initial symptoms of oak wilt. And I didn't mark it on this one, but this area right through here is a fish and wildlife area, and it's loaded with oak wilt. So those areas, they won't do anything. They just let it go on that. So right now, I do try to survey through the white counties to see if I could find any occurrences, and I ask all the foresters, the loggers and everybody to report any oak wilt for me so that I can reconfirm it, especially in all the red counties. I want to try to get it reconfirmed. So this is a purpose for international trade. So that's all I've got for oak wilt for here in Indiana.
Up next, we have an update for Missouri from Sarah Locke, forest health ecologist with Missouri Department of Conservation. Sorry about that.
Yep, that one.
Yep, that's you. All right, Sarah.
All right, see if we got this camera going. No, we don't. My camera's not working. Well, that's all right. You can just envision my face, I hope. So let me share my screen real quick. I promise I'll try and make this smooth for everyone. Well, I don't know if it's going to let me share it correctly. Give me just a moment here. Sorry, guys. Let's see. All right. See if you guys can see my screen. Sorry, it's not letting me go into presenter mode and be able to still navigate. Is this going to work all right?
Yeah, it looks good.
All right, bear with me. So, hey everyone, I'm the new forest health ecologist and pathologist for Missouri Department of Conservation. I've been here since September, did a little bit of time out east before coming back home. I'm really glad to be back. And I'm just going to give you guys a quick update on what oak wilt looks like in Missouri, because from watching everyone else's presentations earlier today, I think we have a pretty different setup, and I'm really sorry for what you guys have to deal with. So in Missouri, we have a ton of oak trees. We have 22 different species. We have an absolute pile of red oaks, which are more susceptible to oak wilt. And we have a pile of white oaks, which are less susceptible, although bur oak has some level of risk that we've seen. And we also have one of our dominant forest species is actually really oak wilt resistant. That's post oak, which has its own suite of issues that we're dealing with. And across the state, we have seen oak wilt in just about every county over the past 50 years. Some of those counties we've gotten multiple hits, some of those counties only once or twice. And this year we had 2025 and 2024, we did oak sampling where we basically opened up to the public the opportunity to send in oak samples from across the state to the Mizzou Plant Diagnostic Clinic and have their oaks tested for a whole suite of things, including oak wilt. And from all those samples that were sent in, we did get some oak wilt positives. So we ended up having 19 total samples come back positive across 6 counties. They were all counties that we've already had oak wilt, in the past. So we definitely have it out there in the environment. And we know that we also are already poised for it to be oak wilt season, even now. If you look at the oak wilt vector emergence model for the furthest south possible point in Jefferson City, Missouri, which is about halfway up our state and well situated within the forested area of the state, we've been in higher risk for oak wilt transmission since midway through February already. So we have the pest, we have the pathogen, we have the right environment already in place for people when they're getting ready to go out and do gardening. No one's, really thinking about gardening yet, and it's already risk season. We also have a lot of possible transmission through spring damage. So not only from people doing some pruning work, but also from our own natural environment. Missouri's kind of a temperamental state. Last year, just in one day, this is the number of recorded tornadoes we had across the St. Louis region. So that's opening up a lot of infection possibilities for trees. But we also have our trees beat to death sometimes by hail. This was another event. Those are not fresh leafed out trees. Those are trees that should have their full leaves in place. And instead, you just see tattered confetti up in their canopies. And the the twigs themselves look like they were just beaten to death in a hammer mill, still on the tree. There was enough hail that one day. They actually had to close a highway down for a little while because it was so thick. So we have a lot of stuff going on. We have all the makings for some serious oak wilt outbreaks, but we really don't see that in Missouri. So what's different? So here's looking at the general idea of how oak wilt spreads, right? We have two main possibilities for movement. We have the fruiting mats that are produced the year after trees are killed from oak wilt. And then we also have infection spread through root grafts. So two different things happening here for us. For one thing, every year we have a bumper crop of rocks. Our Ozarks are producing the best rocks you have ever seen. And that is in the main forested portion of the state where we do have a lot of oaks. There's not a lot of root grafting happening because those trees just cannot do it. I would love to see what would happen if we tried to bring a vibratory plow into our area, because I don't think that would really happen. Luckily, we don't have to worry about that with this. And then the other option we have is the fruiting mat production. And we don't really see a lot of spore mats produced from oak wilt in our trees. And part of that, we think, has to do with the amount of hypoxylin that we have in our environment. You see, anytime that oak wilt happens in the state where we have just oak decline in general, right? Not even oak wilt. Once those oak trees die, very quickly we see hypoxylin canker formation and spread. Hypoxylin is pretty well ubiquitous in our forests, and as soon as those trees reach serious water pressure drops from serious drought issues, hypoxylin takes off and those trees drop out. That is helping to reduce that spore pad formation. And that's in line with some research that was actually done back as late as the 1970s. And just to confirm that, like, we do have pretty notable drought that might be saving our bacon in the state. Here's just a look at what drought looks like for us as a state. You notice we only have 2 weeks out of the last year that there were no dry conditions anywhere in the state. And there's pretty intense drought all in the post-kill season across the main forest producing portion of our state. So with that, if anyone has questions, feel free to ask. If you don't have questions, then okay.
I don't see questions, but there is some conversation around your
Okay, great.
All right. There actually is a question here. Well, I think it's in regards to the vector emergence model that you showed. There's a question about what states that model applies to.
Oh, I'm sorry. Is that a question for me directly about what the model applies to?
Yeah. Do you know that model that you showed? Yeah. What states does that apply to? Would that apply to any state?
Good question. It is not our model. That is a model that's produced by Wisconsin. So I guess, would Kyoko be able to speak more to that model?
Sure. Yeah. So it was originally developed here based on the research studies done on the two major nitidurid beetle vector flight patterns. And so originally it was only for Wisconsin, but the people involved in that the model development thought as long as it's a similar ecosystem, the model should apply. So it was expanded. So Missouri might be kind of pushing to say that it's the same ecosystem. But that was reason that the model territory or coverage was expanded a little bit. It does say as a disclaimer that depending on the ecosystem there, there may be a little bit of a difference in terms of that model applicability.
Right. Yeah, and dovetailing off of that, to Simeon's comment, pointing out that with the warm early season temperatures in many states, just reading it, to get oak wilt infection, you need vectors that have picked up viable spores from spore mats flying to fresh wounds, and just having vector flight activity is insufficient to get an oak wilt infection. That dovetails nicely with that. Yes, like the beetles could be out for us, but if hypoxylin has already knocked out all the trees that would have been producing spore mats anyway, we're not gonna see that transmission, and that might be part of what's happening.
Sarah, there is one more question from Jenny Jeswick. She's asking, what about oak wilt on sandy plains in St. Louis and in the Kansas City areas?
Yeah, and I was just trying to figure out how to respond to it, and my initial response is, I don't know. And the second response is, I'm not sure how many sandy plains we have around the St. Louis and Kansas City areas. If Jenny knows more about that, I'd be more than happy to talk with her.
Great. It looks like Robbie's commented on that as well in the
Yeah.
chat.
Yeah.
All right.
All right. Excellent. Thank you, Sarah. Next up, we're going to have the Wisconsin update. That's going to be another shared session. So that'll be Kyoko Scanlon, forest pathologist with Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources, Kendra White with the Menominee Tribal Enterprises, and Paul Cole with the Stockbridge Muncie community.
Hey, hi everyone. Can you hear me okay? And can you see the slides okay?
Yep, looks good.
Okay. Next is the Wisconsin oak wilt update. And for this session, as Rob mentioned, the three of us will be tag teaming. So I'm Kyoko Scanlon, forest pathologist with Wisconsin DNR, and I will be starting off with a general oak wilt update in Wisconsin, followed by Kendra White, forest health forester with Menominee Tribal Enterprise, and then Paul Call, forest manager, with Stockbridge Muncie community for their oak wilt management effort. So the pathogen of oak wilt was first identified and documented in Wisconsin in the 1940s. Currently, oak wilt has been confirmed in 66 out of 72 counties. Although oak wilt has been found in the majority of the forest for the state, oak wilt is somewhat still uncommon in northern Wisconsin. Oak wilt is well established in central and southern Wisconsin. So in the areas where oak wilt is uncommon, we maintain the oak wilt detection at the township level. In the center map, the counties where oak wilt is common and well established are highlighted in red. And in the counties where oak wilt is uncommon, township level oak wilt detections are highlighted with pink squares. And last year, there were 2 new townships found where oak wilt was detected for the first time, but no new oak wilt county level detection last year. So the current oak wilt guidelines that the Wisconsin DNR uses were developed by the advisory group, which consisted with internal and external partners in 2016. And consideration of the guidelines is required on DNR lands and recommended on other lands. The guidelines specify the calendar dates of oak harvesting restricted period, but also explain examples of flexibility as exceptions and modifications based on biology and economic concerns. The guidelines are available online in a PDF format and also is an interactive guide. In the interactive guide, users were asked a series of questions. And by answering those questions, the users will be given stand-specific oak wilt risk rating and also oak harvesting recommendations. The Wisconsin DNR has been administering federally funded oak wilt suppression program since 2021. The focus of this program is to provide private landowners in areas with limited oak wilt for containing the oak wilt pockets, hoping that the containment work will help slow the spread of oak wilt at the landscape level. Treatments so far we have done include girdle herbicide, cut stump herbicide, rapid response, or combination. So the forest health staff is responsible for the initial contacts and site evaluations, but the actual treatment work is contracted out. So for 4 years, 43 sites were treated, and many of the sites had complex issues, including that multiple ownerships and requiring technical tree removal, which end up in that very complicated coordination work and significant increase in cost. So without the support from this program, many of these sites probably would not have been treated. We received additional funding from the Forest Service, and we plan to offer this program this year. For oak wilt outreach efforts, we have several fact sheets and an oak wilt video available online, and we post oak wilt related articles in monthly forest health newsletters and news releases, and forest health team provides many trainings, workshops, and presentations, as well as site visits. We are also involved in oak wilt research studies, several of them, and you will hear them later today. So with that, I will turn it over to Kendra, and we combined our slides, so I will be forwarding Kendra's and Paul's slides as well.
Thanks, Kyoko. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yep.
Yes.
Right. So I'll start off by introducing myself. My name is Kendra White. I'm the new Forest Health Forester here at MTE. I was just hired right before our oak wilt season this last summer, and I actually have Dave Mazzell sitting here with me. He was in the area and he came by to give me some company during the meeting. So you can jump in if you have anything to say during this. And my first oak wilt season went pretty good, and I really enjoyed the field work aspect of it, especially with it being my first season. So you can go to the next slide, Kyoko. So I put together a map of all of our oak wilt pocket sites for this year, or for 2025. Just want to point out that the pink areas are our Wolf River corridor, where we do not actively manage in due to pretty extensive archaeological discoveries. But as you can see, we mostly manage for oak wilt in our east side of the reservation. That's just where our red oak is most dominant. And there's a plethora of different soils in those areas too. Next slide. So our 2024-2025 comparison, we had a pretty good decrease in the amount of pockets. In 2024, we had 115 pockets, 81 by what we call herbicide and cut treatment, which is bigger, substantial pockets where we do the Bruin rootgraft barrier method. So they're bigger pockets, and we will do the girdle and herbicide, and then later on, loggers go and cut. Rapid response is usually just when there's an active girdling or active wilting tree, and we'll go in and girdle and herbicide just 1 or 2 trees at a time. Like I said, this year we had a decrease. So 93 pockets were treated, 58 by herbicide and cut, and 32 by rapid response. Go to the next slide. Our monitoring and success rates, we usually monitor our previous pockets for about 5 years. So we did 2021 to 2024 this last year.
2024 had 0 failed treatment, so 100% success rate. 2025 was the last year we would monitor for 2021, and we had pretty good success rates there, 93% and 92%. So across 2021 to 2025, we had a success rate that ranged from 92% to 100% across the treatments. We have continued the use of drones, which makes it super easy and more efficient to track the oak wilt pockets on a big level like our reservation is. We used to survey by foot and ATV when Dave was here, and now we'll do mostly by drones. And then I'll go out in ground truth, but I thought this was a cool picture to add in there. That is like a exact picture of a rapid response, or a really good example of what a rapid response looks like from a drone. So when we see those little leaves that are wilting and fine branching, we pretty much automatically know it's going to be a rapid response. And sometimes we'll even put that in like our GIS. So when I go out to the area to ground truth, I can basically make it easier and more efficient. And go to the next slide. This is where I'm gonna end it. I just thought this was a cool find for my first oak wilt season. This is a 50-inch red oak that I found in a pocket. Unfortunately, it did have to be cut. It had risk of root grafting, so I marked it, and it should be cut this winter by a logger. Yeah, I just thought it was a cool find and a cool thing to end my presentation with. So yeah, I'll hand it over to Paul.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Kendra and Kyoko. Yeah, I'm Paul Cole from the Stockbridge Muncie community, and I'll give you a little update on what we're doing at Stockbridge here. Yeah, you can go next slide. Kyoko, you can go to the next slide. So quick thing about Stockbridge, we're about 25,000 acres. We've been treating oak wilt since 2006. Originally tried vibratory plowing, but after wrecking multiple blades, that's never happening again. We're very rocky, end of some glacial outwash and stuff like that. So mostly we're doing the same things as Kendra, and with rapid response and girdling and herbicides. So we've started 2012 really hitting it hard. We had a lot of oak wilt, upwards of 40 to 50 pockets. In 21, we were down to just 7 or 8. So we felt like we were really getting a good handle on it. We had a windstorm in 2022, and since opened up a lot of the canopy, damaged a lot of trees, and so we've been having a big uptick now. I think we had 35 pockets this last season, which then we girdled and herbicided, and have a tribal logger that's going in and salvaging those for us in most cases. We try to make sure we get at least the potential spore producing trees out, and then harvest the buffer trees as well. So on this map, you can kind of see the progression of it. You can also see where it's generally located. We have a lot of wetlands, and then pretty much anywhere that we have soils conducive to oak is where we're finding it. It kind of goes across the whole landscape there. So pretty common in any of our oak stands. A lot of management back in the 80s and 90s really pushed red oak as a tree we were trying to keep. So we have stands that are pretty heavily populated in oak. Most of the sites we're just doing, 1 or 2 spore trees and 5, 6, 7 buffer trees around it. If we get into some weird stands where we're getting a ton of oak wilt popping and we just can't seem to get a handle on it, we will go and do an actual salvage job and really try to knock the oak component down in that stand and regenerate it into something else. So we're kind of trying to get away from those heavy oak stands and get more to a diverse northern hardwood. Trying to think what else we've got going on here. survey a lot of our stuff with drones as well. We do an aerial flight every year. So we're checking at least once the entire reservation, low flying aircraft. And it's been working pretty well. We don't seem to be seeing a lot of stuff that we're missing. But and you can kind of see on this map, the colored stuff's all the Stockbridge property. But there's a lot of fragmentation in there, and working with neighboring landowners to treat their stuff work sometimes, and sometimes they're not interested. So we've still got spores out there, even if we treat all of ours. But I think we're getting a pretty good handle on it, and feel like it's a successful project. So next slide. I don't know what else I got on there. I guess, yeah, most of our trees are 100 to 120, 130 years old. So the oaks that we're losing are quite nice, quite large, also quite valuable, which we are able to salvage in the mills. So that's kind of a bonus anyway. Next slide. Do I have any more? But yeah, so I guess we're small. Oak wilt is very spread out. Oftentimes we can't get a logger to do a ton of it. Luckily, we do have a tribal logger that's small that's able to get in there. But otherwise, this is our crew of Thor and Mark doing our own salvaging. So taking a tractor and dragging it out and cleaning those pockets up. So yeah, that's I guess what I got, and up for questions.
All right. Well, one question I see is what you all use for herbicide.
Stockbridge, I guess can go is we do a 50-50 triclopyr and water. We used to use diesel or some oil surfactant, but it was so hard on the sprayers, and we didn't see any real benefit from going with that over just water. So we've changed to water.
Wisconsin DNR, we use 25% triclopyr and 75% bark oil.
Menominee uses 25% triclopyr, and we've been using diesel. However, we're changing over to bark oil. We just got some bark oil this next season. We'll be using bark oil instead of diesel.
Well, it sounds like I can go down to 25%.
All right, I think that's all.
All right, good. Yeah. Thank you very much.
All right, thanks, guys.
And last but not least, for our program updates, we have Minnesota, Rachel Doobie, Forest Health Specialist with the DNR there in Minnesota.
All right, yeah, good morning, everyone. I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen. Yeah, thanks for that introduction. Really glad to be speaking with everyone today. I'm going to be talking about oak wilt detections in Minnesota in 2025 and highlighting some of our program work as well as the work from our partners. And this kind of satisfying photo shows some spore-producing oaks being burned in a pile last January at one of our state parks. A lot of our parks do very active work in oak wilt management. And this map shows our Forest Health Minnesota DNR team, and overlaid on this map showing our work territories, you can see the dashed lines are our oak wilt range in the state of Minnesota. And oak wilt was first confirmed in the Twin Cities area, kind of around here, and over the last 8 decades or so it has slowly moved out throughout this area. And a primary priority for our team is working on slowing the spread in the northern reaches of oak wilt's range in the state. And unfortunately, in recent years, it has creeped into our northern work areas. But the good news is last year, there really weren't any significant movements. In oak wilt last year, the range only shifted by several miles in a few locations. And then this map shows in black where oak wilt is considered common in our state. And then these blue dots are individual confirmations of oak wilt. These are actually from several years, not just 2025, thank goodness. But as you can see here, it is moving north in this area, actually along the Mississippi River corridor, but that's also a very common travel corridor as well. And there is, for several reasons, a lot of movement of wood products from the Twin Cities and suburbs up into this area as well. But I wanted to highlight some strategic management areas from last year. Down here, about 11 sites were controlled for oak wilt at one of our state parks. And then up here, there are a couple of pockets on private land west of the Mississippi River that were controlled. Over here at one of our state parks, a lot of management for oak wilt took place. That park is very active. And then up here, this is Pine County. About 2/3 of these pockets were presumably controlled just using above ground methods. So it was good to see some management taking place last year. But in this area over here, in this part of the northern reaches, as well as over here, we do have a lot of sandy soils and then a lot of red oak, group oak. So yeah, these are definitely areas that are prime for oak wilt infections, unfortunately. But I did want to highlight some outreach work that our group did last year. Starting off with a webinar that we did January of last year. It is posted both to our website as well as our DNR's YouTube page. And this webinar focused on oak wilt ID and prevention. We've had some pretty significant droughts in recent years and have received a ton of questions about suspect oak wilt from the public and as well as some practitioners. So this is a nice tool to be able to share with people who are concerned that they might have oak wilt and to learn a little bit more about it. And then every year we do 2 media releases. We do one in the winter, letting the public know that now is a good time to prune your oaks. And then we do one in April when risk starts, letting them know to cease those activities to prevent oak wilt spread. We also have a Minnesota DNR oak wilt guide that is on our website, and we have done a number of revisions. The next edition is in progress right now, hopefully be out soon. And going through some of those changes, we did eliminate rapid response as a control option. Simeon Wright from Michigan will be expounding upon that later, the reasons why we've eliminated that. We've also updated our Frill Girl herbicide option based on some recent research to recommend that this is only done for new and small pockets. There's a citation there. And then we've also offered some clarification of the timing of risk. So when we get warm weather in February and March, we get a lot of questions from the public and practitioners on when risk is going to start. So we've taken a look at almost 20 years of weather data from several cities across the state. This is just an example from East Central Minnesota, from the city of Hinckley. And looking at the development of growing degree days for oak wilt vectors, we've been looking at when risk starts and the average risk. And what we're finding is that the start of risk is almost always well after when we advise people to stop pruning, which is April 1st. That is ordinal date 91, if you're taking a look at that graphic. So it's really nice to have this information when folks are getting worried. And we're definitely offering communications on those really warm years when risk does start earlier than April 1st. We've also done a lot of work last year to provide some clarifications on exceptions to prevention for oak wilt management, for forest management, that is for oak wilt prevention. And we have had a series of ongoing questions from our foresters about whether to apply oak wilt harvesting restriction dates for some of our timber permits. And so to really clearly describe what we think is an acceptable risk from harvesting in the high risk period for oak wilt, we created this flow chart last year, very fancy. There's a lot of words on the screen right now, but just as an example, if, say a forester, is managing aspen or pine, an aspen or pine stand with scattered oaks, which is an extremely common situation in Minnesota, following this flow chart, you wouldn't need to provide the oak wilt harvesting restrictions. And this is because this is a very low risk activity, and we are trying to reduce the amount of restrictions that are in place for forest management to occur. And so this will be a nice tool to have going forward. And for those times when foresters don't need to follow the oak wilt risk dates, we do have suggested risk reduction strategies here in this orange box. And I will say that this is something that is not available to the public, but if you're interested in seeing a copy, you can reach out to me. And then let's see, my slides are not wanting to advance. There we go. Okay, and so next, we did receive some bipartisan infrastructure legislation grant funding for outreach, and we're partnering with U of M Extension to produce some oak wilt videos. They are right now working on focusing on some short form videos, which will be super nice to have. We can post those to social media. This is also going to fund an in-person landowner training this summer that is actually going to take place in my backyard. So really looking for, not my literal backyard, this is my work area, but it'll be really good to have that. The public arborists will be invited to that. So it'll be really great. And then they are next going to focus on producing some longer form videos by the end of the year. And then I just wanted to switch over and highlight quickly some oak wilt early detection research that is taking place in Minnesota. This is being done by Nick Raytar, who is a postdoc at the University of Minnesota. His contact information is right there if you have any questions for him. He is deploying a number of insect traps at 12 sites that are in this general area in the green box on Minnesota. I made this map, not him. And then he also included 2 positive control locations that are positive for oak wilt. This is an ongoing project. He started it back in 2024. Results aren't available yet, but we're really looking forward to seeing the results, hopefully using this as an early detection tool. So keep an eye out for any presentations and outreach he'll be doing on his research. Lastly, I just wanted to do a quick look ahead for 2026. Our Minnesota DNR Forest Health team does have access to oak wilt control federal funds, but unfortunately, the federal USDA has halted payments to the state of Minnesota. So it's pretty difficult for us to budget for our work going forward this year, not knowing how that situation is going to unfold. We are also purchasing a vibratory plow using DIL and IIJA grant funding. We were hoping to have that in hand this spring, but unfortunately, again, due to this federal government action against the state of Minnesota, we don't know how that is going to roll out. And it is unfortunate. We were going to share use of that vibratory plow with Wisconsin and Michigan. So hopefully we will know soon what is going to happen on that front. But it'll be really great to have that tool in place. And then finally, just wanted to highlight again, we'll be doing that field training for landowners for U of M Extension. So if you are based in Minnesota and you are interested in attending that, look out for some communications from me. And with that, if there's time, I'd be happy to take any questions. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, Rachel. There is a question from Julie in Michigan saying, if appropriate messaging, can the short videos be shared in other states?
Ooh, yeah, I do believe that there will be an opportunity for that. Julie, I'm going to make note of that, and I will reach out to our U of M Extension partners, and yeah, let's chat about those opportunities. It'd be great to try to share the message about oak wilt.
All right, and it looks like there's some subsequent messaging on that in the chat, but I think that's all for questions.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, excellent. So that concludes the kind of management survey, all that kind of stuff, updates from all of uh, our state, federal partners, and our friends up north in Ontario, and some of our local partners. So hopefully you all have a pretty decent picture of what's going around, what's going on in a lot of these states and what folks are up to. Um, and so now we're going to move on to our research update portion of the program. And the first speaker for research, we're going to be hearing about machine learning applications to improve oak wilt detection in Michigan state parks. And that's going to be with Rahat Iban Rafiq, who's an assistant professor at Grand Valley State University, and Heidi Fry, forest health specialist with Michigan DNR Parks.
Thank you, Robert.
Okay.
Heidi, maybe you share first and then I'll share mine later.
Yeah,
after you. Yep.
I'm trying to share my screen here and we'll see. Hopefully that works. Looks like it's up.
Yep.
Okay, good deal. All right. So thanks so much.
You might want to put it, sorry, you might want to put it in, oh,
There
there
we
it
go.
goes.
There we go.
Nice. Looks
Yeah,
good.
sorry, it was a little slow there. So, okay. So thanks so much. I am hopefully going to be able to speak a little bit slower this time. My name is Heidi Fry. I'm a forest health specialist within our Parks and Recreation Division. And I'm going to go through a little bit more on some of the challenges that we're facing. And, you know, we titled this Keeping Pace because we really are seeing a huge increase in oak wilt on DNR Parks and Recreation Division administered lands. Within our division, I'm our only forester. I manage and really my job is to engineer solutions to protect the cultural, ecological, economic, and the social benefits of our forests within state parks. So with just myself, and then we have a team of field staff that we work with, we really need to look to some more solutions to kind of just keep pace with some of the rapid development. And I will let Rahat, maybe you can introduce yourself a little bit later. Do you want to go ahead and do that now?
Yeah, hello everyone.
Okay.
I'm Rahat Rafiq. I'm an assistant professor at Grand Valley State University. I mostly work with AI, natural language processing, and computer vision. This whole collaboration started when Heidi Fry here contacted me in 2023, and we have been collaborating ever since to build a very scalable system that people can work with when it comes to forest pest like oak wilt and HWA. Yeah, thank you, Heidi.
Yeah, and I may be the only person that's really trying to work themselves out of a job using AI and forest health surveillance, but I really think you know, scaling things up to expand our reach is a benefit. So just to go back a little bit, this project and this idea kind of started years ago with this work that Michigan Natural Features Inventory did in 2019. Using AI and some drone monitoring to detect coastal invasive species. So that was really what led to our project, was thinking about how can we use these applications to really accelerate our ability to find oak wilts. What we find is we have a lot of oak wilt in state parks, and I spend a lot of time, as does our field staff, managing areas like these you can see are in a campground, and we know where they are because there's people there. And so much of what we do really just depends on chance, that somebody happens to be, in this case at Warren Dunes, walking down the trail at the right time and knows exactly, you know, what to do, sees the symptoms at the right time. And in some of these instances, what we find at Warren Dunes, one of our most southern parks, I have seen oak wilt trees flagging all the way from mid-June through the end of September. So that's a huge window for us to have to continually monitor and manage and collect samples and go and perform some kind of management. What's really concerning is that we're spending all of this time and all of this money on these things that are kind of, you know, hey, are these just the obvious things? What is out there that we're not seeing? So this stand here is stand 30 at Warren Dunes. This was inventoried by Michigan Natural Features Inventory. When they did that inventory and looking at some of the factors that they were classifying, this area came back with an ecological integrity score of 5 out of 5, with within our system, that's really extraordinary to have that kind of high quality system within our parks, especially so accessible for the public. I talked a little bit about the camping, and you can see that there's a very obvious footprint of where that developed recreation occurs. And we've had a lot of oak wilt here. So our concern is, are we spending all of this time managing things that are obvious versus, what's lurking out there? We have done some aerial surveys in the past, and that can be a little challenging because there is, of course, coordination involved. Our state park system is spread out pretty far across the state, so it would really entail a lot of flight time getting over Warren Dunes, for example. In this case, back in 2014, we did spot an oak wilt pocket right in stand 30, which also happens to be critical dune. In these areas, this is far off of the trail system. The access is really limited. We are legally actually unable to plow there, and it is so, it would be too damaging to that ecological system. In this case, we ended up doing a girdle treatment, trying to simulate the Bruin model, and that ended up being successful because we were able to see it and able to respond. What we're really trying to aim for is to increase the frequency of those surveys, of the aerial detection. We did start using drones. This year, we've put in a lot of effort into flying in Warren Dunes, PJ Hoffmaster, and I talked a little bit about Yankee Springs. Yankee Springs is about, I think we're 2,100 acres. This is an area that's pretty close to the Grand Rapids metro area. And we were able to fly portions of this, and you can kind of see, and I really apologize, it's hard to hold a remote control, fly the drone, and then take a picture at the same time with your cell phone. But what we're able to do is to delimit these areas of interest, and the drone will set a flight path on its own, and then visually, as the drone is flying, watch that screen looking for those symptoms of oak wilt. And this is something that we really, we're encouraged to use by MTE and pick that up as kind of this way of just monitoring and then responding really rapidly. So what we've done is drop points on there, and you can see all those little diamonds. Those are areas where we did pick up some symptomatic trees. You can just kind of see how that overlays with our trail system there. Covering this area, I think this ended up being about 200 acres on foot would be very challenging just because of the landscape and access. So what we can then do is use a QR code and respond exactly to where these points are, points 17 and 16. Walk out there, and here we have, in this case, a single tree. We were able to collect those leaves, submit them to Michigan State for confirmation that that was a positive oak wilt site, and then rapidly treat that with a double girdle herbicide treatment within just a matter of days. So at Yankee Springs alone, we were able to do that on 60 trees, and you can see the total diameter there, and all of the trees that we were able to pick up just using that, I don't want to say primitive method, but it kind of is, where you're just visually looking at those individual images as the drone flies. One thing I want to point out is that looks like an awful lot of oak wilt, and it is. It's more than I want to have. A lot of those are really kind of single trees. Some of them you can see there's a little bit more of a pocket there. But when you look across the landscape, I like to show this because it really is worthwhile to go out and see. This is Gun Lake in the background. You can see one of our girdle pockets that we've done here. This was along a utility transmission line. But overall, we're not seeing, massive decimation of the forest there. What we really got thinking of is when we do these areas, we're taking and collecting hundreds and hundreds of, thousands of images sometimes. And that's just at Yankee Springs. With just myself as a drone pilot and, flying all of these images, we really are looking for a way to scale this up so that we're not relying on just myself to go out and fly all of these units multiple times a year, because we're seeing, we're seeing symptoms throughout the year at some of these areas. And hopefully we can catch things before they turn into, these larger pockets like this. So breaking Warren Dunes up into several different zones. Here's some images of some things that look like they've been kind of creeping around and hiding there for a few years. This is a good find. Here's a tree that we were able to detect in that same zone that had just started flagging. But what we're really doing is collecting and flying through these different zones and collecting hundreds and hundreds of pictures and images. This was a surprise to me, this zone M, finding what is, I think we all can tell this is a pretty well-developed, an old pocket of oak wilt that's been just really creeping around back there undetected. And part of the reason why is we spend a lot of time ground surveying in this park, but the terrain with that dune landscape is just really challenging to get through there multiple times a year and pick up the symptoms. So I'm going to hand that over and to Rahat, and he can kind of go over how we're using all of these images to kind of scale this up to where we don't really need to rely on that person staring at the remote, the handheld remote, to find oak wilt in those images.
Thank you, Heidi, so much. Just double checking, is my screen shared properly? Can you guys see my stuff?
Yes.
Thank you so much. Okay, so you kind of already Heidi gave this context of like how this collaboration actually started. The whole idea was how can you use AI to take the menial, tedious tasks away from you so that you can actually do the things that are important, that is treating the trees. So looking at all sorts of images and figuring out which images what is probably going to be tedious. And I don't think that's a good way to actually spend all the resources which are already kind of, I'm pretty sure, scrapped. So the idea was we're going to fly the drones all over this forest, and the drones are going to capture images. And can we build an AI system that can go through those images pretty fast and tell you where to look for? We actually had like 4 levels of detection, like no oak wilt, early stage, medium stage, and very late stage, like pretty bad stage. So we collected data from a paper in Minnesota from 2022. They had a lot of images that we got, and we also collected data from Warren Dunes, just like Heidi showed, a bunch of pictures. Across the city parks, there are 4 city parks in the city of Grand Haven and PJ Hoffmaster. As you can see, our drone flight plans on the left-hand side. This was done in 2024. So with all that, we created our training data for our AI model to learn how oak wilt looks like across different stages of oak wilt. And those are the numbers, 366 oak wilt images. We had to augment them because there's not a lot of pictures at oak wilt, obviously. And with negative images, there were like almost 400 of them. So the data was balanced. And based on that, we trained our model. It was a whole collaboration thing between obviously Michigan DNR, City of Grand Haven, and GVSU. And we published our work to a peer-reviewed conference, and we showed that our work, our AI model was able to detect oak wilt with more than 95% accuracy, but also more than 85% recall, because recall is the one, you don't want to miss anything bad. I mean, even if you're false positive, that's okay, but false negatives are like really, really expensive in terms of the consequences. So based on this, all that finding, we actually managed to deploy our work based on several grants that we have received from the state of Michigan. So right now we are live. This is our website. If you have a bunch of pictures from the canopies, from the drones, it doesn't matter high or low resolution. I'm pretty confident it's going to work at low resolution too, even though our model was trained with high-res pictures. What you're going to do, take the SD card from the drone, upload the picture to our website, and the website is going to tell you the 4 stages of oak wilt with different confidence levels. You can look at the pictures, you can give us thumbs up and thumbs down. With those feedback, the AI model will always relearn and make itself better the next time it does those inferences. And you can also see the maps on the other side, like, hey, these are the markers. Maybe you have gone to Warren Dunes, you have all the Warren Dune pictures, it's going to give you markers like, hey, go to point A and point B and point C and point D. These are the markers where we think there is possibly an oak wilt outbreak. Now, we have done several field trips in 2025 with Heidi, and we realized a lot of stuff. We learned a lot of things. One of the things that obviously, like sometimes they will go to places where there's no internet. So you'll fly the drones and then you have to come back and get to a place where there's internet and then upload the picture. It's just, it can be pretty tedious again. So what we have built is like, we have built a device. It's very cheap. It's very cheap. Just like me telling, it's less than $500. So this device doesn't require any internet. You can just get it and you can carry it. It's very small. You can carry it wherever, always. And even if you're in a remote place, remote forest where you don't have any internet, you can still fly your drones. The drone's going to come back. You're going to take the card, SD card with the pictures, and you can use a device, and the device is going to tell you exactly where to go. So yes, okay, I'm going to answer that. So I'm just looking at the chat because somebody asked a question. So this device that you have built is pretty cheap. It's very light, so you can work with it anytime you want. And like I said, once you buy it, you don't have to don't worry about any AI at all. The device doesn't literally have a Wi-Fi driver because it costs money. We try to make this as cheap as possible. So yeah, and you only have the charge to use it, and that's it. You can scan this code to go to our website and check our system out. Probably a question that I actually heard when Simeon from Michigan was saying that, hey, drones are not scalable. That was one of our ideas when we did all these field trips. We figured out that, okay, you cannot fly drones over 360,000 acres of land that Heidi manages, obviously. And for Oakville, because it happens so fast, you have to do it every time. So how do you manage that? We have an idea. Actually, we just got a grant from the state to implement that idea. So hopefully, with satellites, actually, I think somebody was talking about satellites in the chat. Yes, we're going to be using satellites, but there are some problems with satellites. You have some very good satellites. You can get the data from them, but they're expensive. I know how cash-strapped this particular industry, you are not an industry, but this particular space is. So my whole, I would say, mission is to build a system that you guys can use in a very, very cheap way, which is not expensive at all. And you are still able to kind of not just Oakville, but any kind of disease, really. So we are actually using data from Sentinel-2. That's a cheap satellite. The data is free, using AI to detect the anomalies automatically, and then correspond that with the drone imagery and the NAP imagery that somebody has talked about, of course, all those things together in a historical way to let you know, okay, this is the place where you should go right now, and fly the drones there and get the exact disease diagnosis, as opposed to just running around, what disease might you get? So yeah, thank you so much. And these are my email, and that's my phone number. And I'll be, of course, I saw a lot of questions in the chat. I'll be answering them later if we are strapped for time.
All right, thanks so much, Rahat. Yeah, that would be great. I think most of them have been addressed, but there's one about a peer-reviewed journal that the paper was published in. So just that.
Yes, ICMLP. Yep.
Very cool. Thanks so much.
Of course.
Excellent. Thank you. So up next, we're going to hear again from Simeon Wright with Michigan DNR Forest Resources Division about multi-state oak wilt rapid response trials.
Yes, let me see if I can do this better this time. Okay, can you see my screen and hear me okay?
Yep.
All right, perfect. All right, so this trial I'm going to be talking about, the goal is to prevent the scene that you see in the photo here. We want to prevent oak wilt from getting underground and killing nearby trees to create an established pocket of mortality by addressing that initial first overland spread infection. And if this works, it would be huge. It'd be a really nice tool in our management toolbox for those new overland infections when you encounter them before it's progressed. All right, so Menominee Tribal Enterprises in Wisconsin has been girdling and herbiciding single trees to prevent underground spread for many years with a high degree of success, and other partners have also been trialing this technique. So we wanted to set up a replicated trial across Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Michigan to see if we could get similar results. So the idea is you get these first-year infections like you see in the photos there before that tree has completely wilted and died. and treat that tree to prevent it from spreading. So the project was led by James Jacobs with Forest Service, Forest Health Protection Group in St. Paul, and funding from Special Technology Development Program and the Forest Service Pest Suppression funds were utilized. I also wanted to thank Mike Hillstrom specifically for the data summary across the 3 states and for many of the slides that I'm showing today. So our methods standardized across the 3 states. We selected sites where we had a oak that we were going to intentionally infect, surrounded by 4 additional oaks within 60 feet. Minnesota used northern pin oak, Wisconsin and Michigan used northern red oak in this study. So we intentionally infected these trees and monitored for symptoms. When trees became symptomatic, we confirmed it via lab testing and then treated that tree with either a girdle or girdle herbicide treatment at multiple time periods after those symptoms began to develop. And the idea here is we're going to monitor these sites for 5 years for underground infection that is spread through root systems that kills the adjacent trees. Here's what the girdle herbicide treatment looked like. It's the same treatment that's been talked about already today. 25% triclopyr and bark oil sprayed to wet the girdle. And we ran into a few challenges. It's not an easy project to undertake. First, finding property managers that are willing to let you intentionally infect trees with oak wilt can be a challenge, but all 3 states were successful. Then our original plan was to prune the oaks during the high-risk period for natural infection and utilize any naturally infected trees that we encountered as well. So we selected time periods in the middle of the high-risk infection period. Our sites were quite close to known oak wilt infections, spore mats around with viable spores. And then we prune these trees by cutting 2 branches, 25 to 30 feet high in the canopy, roughly 2-3 inch diameter branches. And I have to say, if you've ever used a rope saw to cut branches high in trees in a forest environment, it's about impossible, I think, to prevent getting that rope and the rope saw tangled and stuck in other trees. So, me doing it looks kind of like the cartoon image there, but we had staff that were really good at this technique, and we managed to prune across the 3 states 72 trees this way. Unfortunately, only 5 of those trees were confirmed to have oak wilt infection subsequently. So, we all know that you get oak wilt infections by wounding trees at the wrong time, but when you do it on purpose, it doesn't always necessarily work quite as well. So with that in mind, the next 2 years, we did an artificial inoculation of these trees. So we were able to get Forest Service tree climbers and did an artificial inoculation, again, branches 25 feet plus up in the canopy of the tree. And we used 500,000 spores per milliliter injected into those branches in a hole drilled in the branch. And across the 3 states, we had variable levels of infection, but overall of 171 trees that we inoculated, we had 115 that wilted, 67% success rate. So much better there. So looking at our success with the treatments, it's important to keep in mind that we're just 1 to 2 years out from the treatment. So these numbers could change significantly as we continue to monitor these sites. But so far in Michigan, we've had a 24% failure rate, 57% in Minnesota, and 26% in Wisconsin. So that means out of 115 trees that were treated, we've had 40 failures, or 35% so far, just 1 to 2 years out. A lot of these failures occurred either the year of treatment or the year after. We did see fewer additional failures in 2025, but it is way too soon to say what degree of success we will end up with in the end. And again, the monitoring is going to continue for 5 years, so that's through 2029. You may note that it looks like a similar failure rate for a girdle-only treatment and a girdle herbicide treatment, but you also have to keep in mind that more trees were treated by the girdle herbicide versus the girdle only. So some other details and questions here. I think not only are we learning about a new potential management technique here, but also something about initial oak wilt infections. And Michigan and Wisconsin had trees that we inoculated in 2023 that did not wilt until 2024. And the photo there is a tree in Wisconsin that was inoculated in June 2023. Maybe some symptoms just starting on a branch in October, but Wisconsin reports that that tree did not actually become fully symptomatic until summer 2024, and they did confirm oak wilt infection in that tree. So, just important to, I think, to keep that in mind. We can never be super confident just because the tree wilts at a certain time that it became infected at a specific time. But some other points, confirming oak wilt before treatment, often these trees were 80% wilted before the treatment actually occurred because we had to send in and get lab tests before we treated that tree. So, one question as to why maybe we're seeing quite a number of failures is because we were treating them after the symptoms had so well developed in the tree. But it's also important to point out that in Minnesota, 31% of their failed treatments did occur on trees that were treated at less than 10% wilt. We have other questions about the height of the wound or site of inoculation on that tree, the size of a wound or infected branch that becomes infected, and whether or not that could be important in how successful this technique is. Maybe even a bigger question is, could treatment success depend on a natural infection where a beetle's walking across a wound and depositing some spores, versus an artificial inoculation where we are injecting 500,000 spores down into the xylem of that tree? Another question that we've thought about that comes from Minnesota is whether or not drought can play a role in infection. In 2023, the initial year of artificial inoculations, Minnesota had some pretty significant drought and had a 31% success rate in inoculating those trees and getting infection, whereas in 2024, a very wet spring, 85% of the inoculated trees wilted. So moving forward, as I've mentioned, the treatments were completed in 2024. We're going to continue monitoring these trees, and then eventually we will clean up these sites and eliminate the oak wilt issues that may be resulting from any failed treatments. And it depends on the state on exactly what we'll do, whether it's vibratory plowing, girdle herbicide treatment, or other future forest management activities. And again, I mentioned this earlier today, but just a reminder about the dangers of girdling, making sure that those trees are sounded first. In this trial, Wisconsin did have a tree that failed as they were doing the girdling. And then finally, just want to emphasize that a lot of people have been involved in this project. It's not an easy thing to do. And these photos are from Wisconsin and the Wisconsin folks, but Minnesota and Michigan also had a lot of folks that we're out there in the heat dedicating a lot of time to this trial and just want to recognize that. And that's all I have. I'd be happy to take any questions if there's time.
Jess had to step away for a second, but I can handle the questions. Rob, do you think we have time in between?
We can do one question.
Okay. First question here then is from Julie asking, what do you consider a failure? Spread to adjacent trees, question mark?
Yes, exactly. So a failure would be spread to an adjacent tree. So the fungus has gotten underground, moving through root systems and killing that adjacent tree. That's when we would consider it a failed treatment.
And then we might have time for one more. Bryce June asked, why not just damage the tree ground level area and inoculate that? Seems like a lot of extra work to climb the trees.
Yeah, great question. The reason for that is if we inoculate at ground level, by the time we see infection in the canopy, there's a good chance the fungus has already moved down underground. And I may not have explained that very well, but the idea behind girdling or girdle herbiciding that tree is to prevent that fungus from continuing to spread to the point where it gets underground. And so, you wound the tree at ground level or inoculate it there, that fungus is already really close to the root system. And really what we're trying to do is emulate what might happen in, natural infections. And of course, those can occur close to the ground. And that is another question, whether infections that start close to the ground, this technique is even less likely to work in those situations.
All right, great. Thank you, Simeon. We're going to move on now to our last presentation before our extended 30-minute break. We're going to hear oak wilt management, oak wilt pathogen, and the paradox of new paradigms by Jed Muner, research scientist, Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources. Take it away, Jed.
Okay. Are you seeing my screen, Rob?
Yep.
And hearing me? Okay, great.
And hearing you. Looks good.
So I'm going to jump right in. I'll try not to make you late for our lunch break, but so just starting off, I want to acknowledge that I'm working with a team here in Wisconsin and going to sort of give an overview of this project at a high level, a project that really is ongoing that we're just starting to collect results from. But setting the stage for a paradox of new paradigms. So this shouldn't be news to anybody in this group, but oaks are really, really important throughout the eastern United States, and we're having really what could be called a crisis of regeneration. So we're seeing a lack of regeneration, pretty much at a big picture, at least across the board, across much of the range of oak abundance in the eastern United States. And so the situation is noteworthy. And maybe it goes without saying that, we're talking about a disturbance-dependent species. My sort of specialty is fire and fire disturbance. We heard earlier this morning already that, some of the trees that are being cut for oak wilt are 120 to 130 years old. So a lot of these oaks we can trace back to a change at the time of what I'll call European settlement. But this is a Sargent map of the proportion of woodlands burned in 1880. And so we were very much a fire country and a fire geography. And so what we also know, and I've been hearing from managers throughout the region, is that there's some concern, about injury. Prescribed burning is being increasingly used for managing oak systems. And we know from work by Joe Marshall and others that, you in a oak system with regular use of fire, you can have the majority of your oak trees have fire injuries. And so we really set out to ask a series of related or related questions. So the first is, at a broad scale, at a landscape or a stand scale, does fire attract sap beetles or what sorts of insects, or do they avoid those areas? So that's sort of your stand scale. And then getting more nuanced, we wanted to know if we created injuries on trees and we burned them and we compared them to injuries created that were unburned, is there some difference that at that scale at an individual tree? And then isolating that second piece a little bit. So if sap beetles, for example, are attracted to wounds that have char on them, can oak wilt be transmitted? And so that's a portion of this study that was a challenge study. And so this is sort of fine tuning that a little bit. Here's a map of our study areas. So we used trapping and within burned units and adjacent unburned forest in 3 different sites to try to compare the insect abundance between burned and unburned sites. And then we also created injuries, and we used a propane torch and we burned half of those injuries and left half unburned to make that comparison. And then the last thing we did was we created injuries, burned using a propane torch those injuries, and inoculated them to see if they became infected with oak wilt. And then lastly, we had one of our sites, we used 5 trees that we basically set up a positive control. So what we did was we wounded those trees and inoculated them without the burning, just a sort of a proof of concept. And so many of you all know this bit better than I probably, but this is really what the business of trapping looked like. We attracted insects. We were mostly interested in fresh injuries, so we defined that as within 4 days. So in this case, we set out traps the day of, immediately following a burn, and then the same time in the adjacent forest, and then revisited those for 4 days, or actually 4 days after. And these are the burn dates. So we're talking, everything I'm talking about here is really during the high risk transmission period. And so the methods, this is what we're talking about with wounding treatments, and we really followed methods from Tara Ball, who was super supportive and helped us answer questions and get us started on this. Many thanks to you, Tara. But this is what that looks like. So we had wounding treatment, so 10 trees that were cut with a hole saw, and then we fitted them with a rain hood so that the insects wouldn't get washed out of those injuries, and put the plug back on. And then another subset of those where we did the same thing, but we used a propane torch to burn those injuries. And then for the inoculant treatments, we used caulk because we really didn't want to compromise our study or introduce unwanted spread of oak wilt. So we really didn't want sap beetles visiting those trees and moving throughout the forest. So in that case, we use caulk to sort of seal up those injuries. So that's what that looks like. And then just really basic preliminary results. So these are our 3 sites. This is the wounding and burning portion of the study. And so we did have some oak wilt positives in our wound plus burn treatment. We had a tree, and then, so we have some evidence at least that burning may not be, it may not protect trees completely from oak wilt transmission. So these are insects that are visiting these wounds. And then what's fascinating really is that I mentioned we had positive controls where we wounded and inoculated without the intermediate step of burning. And that was at Peter Helland, 5 trees, and 60% of those were positive. So what's fascinating about that, and I think we just started to hear that in the previous talk, is some of these things are messy and they take time. So there were a few surprises in this work, that being one of them. So what I assumed would be a neat, tidy study and completed within 1 year last summer is continuing. So we're going to continue to do checks and continue to monitor those and do containments. And so, and also for this same data, what's sort of interesting is that, you know, with the insect abundance, now this is not just this isn't sap beetles, it's all insects, but we tended to find more insects on our wound and only as opposed to wound plus burn. And really the opposite situation seemed apparent anecdotally in our trapping, where there were more insects collected in our burned units than adjacent unburned units. And so more to be done, more to learn here. A lot more work in terms of, you know, figuring out not just insect abundance, but what insects we're talking about, in particular sap beetles. And so really to try to summarize this, we have a lot of work to do yet. We're seeing some evidence that their burning may not be affording the level of protection that maybe I assumed going into this, or that we expected. So that's something we're learning about. And then I think we also just heard about the time involved in this and as part of the messiness. And so I will say that even with our inoculated trees, it generally took about the 4th check. So we did checks every few weeks. So we're looking at 2 months from the time of treatment to a symptomatic tree at least, and maybe a positive test result. And so there's lots of ways that studies like this can get messy. And I've just sort of touched on a few of those. One of our sites had an abundance of beaver and beaver damage during the high risk period. Luckily, they didn't compromise our trees in the study that we're using, but this just gives you one idea of how the best laid plans to keep things neat and tidy can become messy with time and with a real system. More to do. So with that, I'll just end. Thank you.
Thank you, Jed. Trying to see if we have any questions in the chat here. Greg asked, how about the converse research question? Is oak wilt a symptom of long-term fire suppression? If fire dries out systems, anti-messification, then time since fire, fire severity, fire intensity may be correlate. Fire chronology works across states and landscapes as well.
Yeah, I think if I'm interpreting that question right, there's 2 parts that I think about at least. So one, at a landscape level, one could argue that oak wilt pathogen is really just an inefficient, slow-moving fire. We never had this much red oak on our landscapes. Fire would have been the primary factor keeping red oaks limited or more limited in abundance. So in that regard, that's one part of the question. And then I think what I heard, the other part is, you know, with fire suppression and a lack of fire, the fires that do occur may be higher severity with different effects. And I think that also could be true. Now, I will say, like a lot of our prescribed burning, so what I'm generally talking about, we're burning under really a specific set of conditions. And so even our higher end severity prescribed burns are going to be moderate in severity in the big realm of things. I'm not sure if I got all that answered or not, but good question.
Yeah, it sounded good. Thank you, Jed. I think we only had one other question here, or maybe 2 now. Dylan asked, maybe I'm misunderstanding, but how would fire protect the oaks?
Well, we're not gonna, we are literally losing oaks. In Wisconsin, red and black oak have declined 50%, and they're gonna, since about 1950, and they're declining now. So maples are co-dominant in oak dominated systems. Were once oak dominated and with no regeneration. So we are desperately looking for ways to sustain oak on landscapes, and fire is going to have to be part of that work.
Absolutely. I think we just have one final question here. Anna asked, Jed, do you think that the pheromone radiated further in burn sites, potentially attracting insects from a greater area compared to unburned sites?
Well, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. But the short answer is I don't know. The longer answer is that I would have expected maybe the opposite to occur. I mean, assuming that sap beetles aren't attracted to freshly burned areas, you have, probably I think maybe the char and the burning and the smoke would actually mask some of the attractant, but I really, that's nothing but a a guess at best.
Up next, we have Ethan Wackendorf, graduate research assistant at Michigan State University, to discuss inoculum loads, timing and severity. Take it away, Ethan.
Can you see my screen okay and hear me?
Yeah, it's in presentation mode now. Perfect. Yep, go ahead.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you. Thanks everyone for the opportunity to talk today about some of my research during my master's program at MSU. I think this is a nice little follow-up to some of what Simeon was talking about with rapid response and what they've seen in symptom development and based on their artificial inoculations. So let's hop right into it. There we go. So for some background, I'll just talk a little bit about the sites that I've had the opportunity to work on during my program here. So the star in blue, I'll be referring to as Coyote Road. Both of our sites are in the northern lower peninsula of Michigan here, working on predominantly northern red oak stands. And we had 3 different site years. So 2 inoculation experiments at Coyote Road, the first being in August 2023 and the second in July of 2025. And then Bunker Hill at Red Star, close to Traverse City, actually in Williamsburg, was our other site year where inoculations were performed in June of 2024. So what I want you to remember here is that that August inoculation is a late season inoculation, whereas the other 2 experiments were performed mid-season during high severity. So the way that symptoms present might be a little different, and we'll get into that as we go. As for the actual setup of the experiment, 20 healthy red oaks were selected at Coyote Road in 2023 and Bunker in 2024. These were all outside of grafting distance from any other potentially symptomatic oaks, as these sites have natural infection on them and have also been used for MSU experiments in the past. So we just wanted to make sure that there is no confounding there. Additionally, in 2025, we only selected 10 healthy mature red oaks at the Coyote site, simply because the objectives of that experiment were a little different, but some of the data is used in what I'm going to talk to you about today, as we took the same measurements of tylosis production and visual symptom development in the canopy. There are slight differences in the inoculum groups that we used for these artificial inoculations on the 20 red oaks at each site. So in 2023, we used a control or a negative control water-based suspension on 5 oaks, and then 5 others were inoculated with 500 spores per ml, 5,000 spores per ml, and then 500,000 as kind of our high-end positive control. And then we changed this range a little bit at Bunker in 2024, removing that 500 spore load and replacing it with kind of a moderate in between of 50,000 spores per ml. As for the methods here, what we started by using a local isolate of Bretziella fagacearum and culturing it to create our stock suspension, from which we quantified our concentrations using hemocytometer, just to make sure all of our concentrations were accurate in their own vials before going to the field. And then we also quantified and made sure that all of our suspensions were viable by doing CFU counts before going to the field, and then immediately after coming back from the field, just to make sure that we didn't have any loss of viability in doing our inoculations. And all of that came back clean for all of our groups. The inoculations were performed at breast height on the main stem of the oak. And this was done by collecting a short increment core. As you can see, just a stock image of an increment bore essentially on the bottom left. And then that wound was where we inoculated with our suspensions just using a syringe, waiting for the outer 2 rings of xylem vessels or growth rings to soak up the suspension before plugging the wound and covering it to make sure that we didn't have any additional nidodulid access to the wounds or any potential other fungal contamination that could have messed with our concentrations or the actual infection process. And then these short cores were kept as kind of a baseline measurement for some of our vessel measurements and tylosis measurements going forward. So here's a picture of kind of what we did with our short cores that we collected. You can see on the bottom left, this one is a core from an unhealthy oak, a symptomatic oak from these experiments, where you can see in that outer ring of early wood vessels, there's heavy occlusion with tyloses. And on the right is a healthy asymptomatic core showing very open, healthy vessels. All of our cores were cut at that second year of just below the second year of early wood, as we're only interested really in those outer 2 vessel rings. And then the number of tyloses was evaluated in each of our cores at biweekly time points throughout the season. Additionally, measurements of the area of all of the vessels, early wood vessels in each of these cores was performed using ImageJ and a Leica dissecting microscope. So to get into some of our visual canopy severity rating results, here I just want you to focus on this graph on the right side with all these panels. Don't worry about the numbers at the top of each of the panels. Those are just individual tree IDs. What's really important is that each row shows the 5 trees grouped into their inoculum concentration group. And then AUDPS is a representation of severity measurements at different time points throughout the season. And you end up with this ultimate AUDPS score that's shown at the top of each panel as kind of a total severity rating. And so what we see here is that our 500,000 spore group resulted in 4 out of 5 positive or symptomatic trees, whereas we had none in our 5,000 spore group, 1 in our 500 spore group, and our negative controls were clean. And then what you will also notice is that the rate at which those steps increase is much more dramatic in the 500,000 spore group as opposed to the one that we have in the 500 spore group, indicating more rapid disease progression and symptom severity in the canopy. Now, if we look at Bunker 2024, these visual symptom ratings were performed in the same season, whereas the ones in Coyote 2024 were performed right after leaf out. Again, these were late season inoculations in 2023, where we rated symptom development in 2024. So the main difference you'll see between the two is that our first point of AUDPS increasing or symptoms in the canopy being noticed is quite a bit later in the season. Another thing, just anecdotally, that I'm sure a lot of you have seen when out in the field looking at trees that might have been infected at the latter part of the last season is that oftentimes those trees will present symptoms differently. Their leaves when coming out will start to form, but will be stunted, but still green. And then as the season progresses, a lot of those leaves will begin to fall off, maybe bronze. Whereas the same season infection, typically that bronzing and the upper canopy flagging is what you first see. But again, we see that our 0 and 5,000 spore group resulted in no infection, whereas our higher inoculum doses or loads resulted in infection in 3 out of the 5 trees each. And the symptom development was a little more rapid and severe in the 500,000 spore group as compared to the 50,000 spore group. And another measure or way to use AUDPS is looking at kind of standardized AUDPS just to be able to compare across site years. And so what you'll see here, and I included Coyote 2025, just even though we didn't do any of the other inoculum concentrations that year, is just as a way of seeing that even with the same inoculum concentration, there's still variation year to year in terms of the severity and the speed of symptom development. As you can see, that bar is much smaller than Coyote 2024 or Bunker 2024. But another main takeaway is that if we combine our 2024 site years, we see that the 500,000 spore group statistically significantly separates from the 0 and 5,000 spore concentration. And in Coyote 2024 alone, it separates from that lower 500 spore load in terms of speed of symptom development and severity. So one takeaway might be that 2024 was a little bit more conducive to symptom progression, or maybe this is just an artifact of that being a late season infection leading to slightly earlier symptom development and rating. If we're looking at our core results here, you can see that the actual across all of our ring 1, ring 2, bunker, and coyote, there's really no pattern in terms of the size of vessels leading to vessels being open or occluded, tyloses developing there or not. It's been hypothesized in the literature that maybe the size of vessels is related to this kind of symptom development. And that might be true when looking at early wood vessels versus late wood vessels that are dramatically different in size. However, when we're looking at just early wood vessels, there's really no pattern. And so I don't think that, at least based on these data, that we can say that larger vessels tend to lead to more occlusion. And the bottom left box does show some difference that we saw in that inner ring. However, because there's no trend, I think this is more of an artifact of just variation in small sample size. As for looking at occlusion probability across the season, in our asymptomatic trees on the left and our symptomatic trees on the right, we see, as expected, that the asymptomatic trees had very low to no occlusion throughout early, mid, and late season. However, in our symptomatic trees, we are seeing this occlusion, particularly in the mid to late season. And some of that occlusion being present in the early season in coyote, in the middle panel on the right, again, might be due to some of this occlusion and these tyloses developing at the end of the season in 2023, whereas they only start to present as visual symptoms in 2024, even though the occlusions and tyloses are there earlier. And just for some effect sizes, in 2024, we found that symptomatic outer ring vessels were 102 times more likely than their counterpart, asymptomatic outer ring vessels, to become occluded with tyloses. And as just another snapshot of the timing component, we found that approximately every 25 days, the odds of occlusion increased from 2.7 times more likely to be occluded in 2024 and up to even 3.5 times more likely in 2025 to be occluded. And these late season effects are much more dramatic, as we'd expect. As for occlusion probability by inoculum group, this is not quite as informative or dramatic, but really what I want you to take away and what the main finding is from these models and these results is that we do have a occlusion by time trend where in our higher inoculum load groups, 50K and 500,000 spores, we see that especially in mid and late season, we have more vessel occlusion, but not necessarily across all of our time points do the 50K and 500K separate in terms of occlusion probability. And this predicted occlusion probability is slightly lower if you see on that y-axis when compared to the last figures, just because this includes all vessels, not just those symptomatic vessels. However, the trend of increasing occlusion probability does exist across sites and inoculum groups. So some of the conclusions, red oaks inoculated with 50K and above spores were significantly more likely to become infected. However, only the 500,000 spore group was actually able to be differentiated in terms of visual symptom development and speed of symptom development when compared to our other inoculum groups. Early wood vessels don't really, the size of these early wood vessels don't really seem to indicate like greater likelihood of occlusion as they become larger. And as we'd expect, the outer ring of symptomatic trees is much more likely to become occluded than asymptomatic trees, but also more likely to become occluded than that secondary ring or that inner ring in symptomatic trees, just indicating that the pathogen much more easily takes hold in that ring, but not necessarily that it's impossible to see symptom development in that inner ring of vessels. And occlusion severity does increase with inoculum concentration. I'd like to acknowledge all of my committee members and lab members in the Chilvers and Forest Pathology Lab, as well as the funding sources that have allowed me to do this research and all my other projects while at MSU. So I'd be happy to take some questions from the chat.
Great job, Ethan.
Thank you.
That was really, really good. I think we might have had a question about the number of oak wilt spores on that can be found on nitidulid beetles, but it looks like Karen Deep might have answered that question already in the chat. If you want to touch on it, feel free.
Yeah, it's highly variable that we have found. So Karan is really one of the people who's worked largely. So I definitely trust what he said. I'm just getting to read it now.
Yeah, he said
but,
6,000 to 7,000 for Sei and truncatus.
Yeah, and that's what we found in Michigan. And there might be some variability between different studies in Wisconsin, Minnesota, and so forth. So I definitely suggest looking into the literature for your specific area when it comes to that.
And then we have one question from Anna. Sorry if I missed this. What height did you do your inoculations?
Yeah, Anna. So the height was approximately breast height, so like 1.5 meters off the ground. I tried to stay consistent. That's with like just below my chest level, I guess. And then I guess I didn't mention this in the methods, but all of our subsequent cores that were taken for measurement were taken above and to the side of the previous core that was taken, just to avoid any kind of wound interference or occlusion caused by wounding that might have happened from each of our sampling events. You're welcome.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Ethan.
Yeah, thanks. Appreciate it.
All right. Very good. Thank you, Ethan. So next up, we have Tara Ball with Michigan Technological University, assistant professor there in forest health, associate professor in forest health, to talk about spring bud break phenology.
Right. And I cannot tell if my screen is sharing yet.
Yep, it looks good.
All right. Well, I'm gonna minimize that. And thank you very much for everybody who's on this afternoon here. My name is Tara Ball. I'm based in Houghton, Michigan, in the Upper Peninsula out of Michigan Tech, and I'll be talking a little bit about our phenology work that we've been doing with vector activity. The projects and the amount of data that we've collected goes way beyond this, so I'm trying to put a lot into about a 12-minute talk, and I'm happy to talk through some questions. Or my co-PI, Sharon Reed, is on the call. Maybe she can answer some questions in the chat too if they come up during this. Katie Bershing, I've also got her name on the title slide here. She was my graduate student who's working on this project in 23 and 24 and has since graduated and is working diligently on getting our papers out there and be published here. So I think James Jacobs wrote, "Teamwork makes the dream work," and that's definitely the case with this project. This has been a number of years, but in 23 and 24, we have a number of sites that went across Michigan, Ontario, and New Brunswick. And so our work looking at phenology and nidulid activity, we've really been focusing above the current range of oak wilt. That's what we kind of initiated working together in 21 to try to understand and be able to predict risk of oak wilt expanding further north. And since 21, as we all know, we've had a number of different cases and instances where oak wilt has expanded up. It now looks like our site that's in Gwinn is in Marquette County. That's oak wilt positive in Michigan. It wasn't when we started this site. Our site is not where they found oak wilt. But we do have one positive site that's been our sort of control site, if you will, throughout the number of years that we've been doing this work in Crystal Falls, Michigan. All the other places where we've been collecting nidulid data has not been oak wilt positive. But you can see the number of collaborators listed on the slide here and sort of the range of our sites going across all the way to New Brunswick. So in 21 and 22, those were our first year of collaboration field studies, and we were really working on the whole entire summer trying to better evaluate that timing between hosts and vectors and the environment in the areas further north of the range, to improve some guidance for that overland spread. But as we got into a couple of years of that work, we anecdotally noticed a couple of things, and I'll tell you that story here in a second. But in 23 and 24, our main goal, or one of our main research objectives, is really to explore that relationship with nididulid entering wounds, and then spring phenology of our host trees, and that relationship with growing degree days and environmental factors. And so really quickly, to get into our methods, we collected nididulids using both lingering and wind vane flight traps at all of our field sites. They were baited and had the bread dough bait and the pheromone bait on them. But then we also created artificial oak wounds in trees, and I'll show you that in a second. Jed talked about that earlier this morning. For our sites, we collected all different kinds of information about the environment and tree size, coarse woody debris, the canopy light. Climatic data was collected throughout the seasons that we were doing sampling, all to try. All these variables are things that at some point in the literature have been associated with nididulid population influencings. So we were trying to make sure that we covered all of the bases of what could potentially explain something going on in a site. But for the timing of beetle collection, for the most part, in general, we collected beetles twice a week, every week per site. And then we collected all that environmental stuff, usually just once a year, except for climate was going on daily. For the wounding method that we use, this is going back to some work that Jenny Jeswick and some others have done. We were focusing in 23 and 24 on about an April to the end of May, early June timeline, but we used a 2.5 centimeter hole saw to drill a hole into the tree just past the bark, just into the xylem layer. And when you get that in there, you can almost feel it pop, and that little bark plug comes off. We did include the little rain shield that's got caulk on it so that no rainwater or anything could flush out the beetles. The bark plug is put in there pretty loosely, but still hard enough that it sits. But if you wiggle that hard enough, you can pull it open. And if it's attractive to the beetles, there'll certainly be a lot of beetles up underneath of that and sort of in the cracks around the bark from that artificial wound there. We can carefully collect them and not drop them. But it's really important to note that we were checking all of these wounds at least twice. And the first time period was within 8 to 72 hours post wounding. So we called those fresh wounds within about 3 days of time frame. And then 3 to 6 days or older, we just called those old wounds. And that 3-day time period, or about that 72 time period hour, is really important in literature. That's what we use for our cutoff days. Past that fresh wound time period, the wounds are considered much less viable for spores to actually grow inside of them. So in our first sampling efforts, when we were collaborating together, we were doing this, like I said, across the entire season, really trying to look at this timing. And we were getting tons and tons of beetles in our traps, but none in our wounds. And at first, there was a little bit of self-doubt there. We thought maybe we're wounding the trees wrong or something. We asked a couple of people, oh, no, you're doing it right. But within a couple of weeks, then we started seeing those wounds filling up with beetles, just like the traps were. And so it kind of became, well, what might have been the trigger was that question there. And anecdotally, we kind of remembered, well, when we started to see beetles going into the wounds was when the leaves came out. So that really is what shifted our 23 and 24 sampling years to focus on including that spring bud phenology in there as part of the data that we were actually collecting and quantifying. So we focused on an 8-week timeline from the early part of April to the end of May, and we developed a 1 through 6 phenology rating. I'll show you that here in a second. And where we used binoculars to look up into the upper canopy of the trees. We did trainings between all of our collaborators to make sure we were rating trees the same way. And basically, anytime we were at these sites, we could record our phenology down when we were doing wounding or collecting beetles on 20 trees per site. So we have continuous average site phenology going on. So that rating scale that we use, this is developed for Quercus rubra, northern red oak is our primary species. There were a couple of sites that had some northern pin oaks, but I don't think any of those they were not phenology trees or wounded trees if we could help it. A rating of 1 is the trees are still dormant, but a rating of 2, you can just see the buds starting to get a little bit swollen. Those scales are elongating. It's clearly they're no longer dormant, winter dormant time. Bud break is rating of 3 or 4. And leaf out was a rating of 5 or 6, where the leaves are either out, they might still be curled up or quite small, but then full leaf out is when the leaves were at least flattened all the way. And so if you're doing a mean rating for a site and you're using a whole number, if you have anything rated above a 2, if your mean rating is 2.6, a majority of those trees at that site or in that stand were in bud break fully. So just a little bit of our nidulid collection summaries here. Our difference in years between 23 and 24 is pretty abundant. We did end up with over almost 40,000 nididulids that were sampled and identified between all of our sites in those 2 years. 23 was a banner year, but we also had a couple more sites that we didn't revisit in 24 just because of they either weren't that good site or they were hard to access, or we were trying to save a little bit of funding there, but we still got almost 40,000 beetles in total. And if you look at our trap type, breaking that down a little bit more by those fresh wounds and old wounds, again, we were the most interested in fresh wounds because these are the ones that are really the most susceptible to the beetles bringing the fungal spores into them. We had only 170 total nididulid collected in fresh wounds across all of the sites that we were working in Michigan and Canada. It's less than 0.5% of the total amount of beetles that we collected came out of those fresh wounds. It's kind of a good story if you're trying to prevent oak wilt, right? A little bit more about the species of beetles that were going into them. You could ignore all the other numbers here, but I think the most interesting is that out of the 37 or so total nididulid species that we collected and sampling, only 10 species were found in fresh wounds. And there definitely were some differences. There was overlap there, but they weren't all exactly the same as found in the flight traps, and vice versa. We would get some in flight traps that we never found in wounds, and the other way around. But when it comes to phenology, this is our mean phenology rating or phenophases going across the bottom here. These are all of our sites for year 23 and 24. And the beetle that's on that bar for that week is the first time we got a beetle in a fresh wound at that site. And you can see at a number of sites, we were sampling in them for weeks before we found a beetle at this site. And what's also interesting is that every time we see a beetle at a site, even in that one that's very early at the Heart's Desire site in Ontario, the week of April 9th to 15th and 23, the phenology phase is already this orangey color that's already between a 2 and a 3. There were already trees that were breaking bud by the time we first got in there that first week. But everywhere else, they're orange or further on into leaf out time before we saw any beetles present in those fresh wounds at those sites. So looking at some of the total abundance of beetles, this is again a couple of different figures of fresh wounds versus all wounds. You see sort of a pulse of beetles at around bud phenology phase of 3, and then again at 6 at the end when full leaf out, there's all kinds of beetles for coming into those fresh wounds. But when you're looking at flight traps or panel C, it's almost just scattershot. There's beetles being present in those flight traps the entire time we're sampling, but it's very similar to what we found in those first years working, that we were getting a lot of beetles in those flight traps before the leaves were coming out or before the buds were breaking, before we start seeing them in those fresh wounds. So just looking at that a little bit differently, could explore lots of different ways to compare this. This is by calendar date across the bottom with just our Michigan sites and the beetles going into flight traps here. From leaf out time period or average leaf out, there's lots of beetles, but even in the flight traps all the way in the very early part of April, we could see that there are lots of beetles being collected in those flight traps, and including when there's just a few trees, that initial bud break, it's getting just above a 2 with this average phenology rating. That line, that black line is right above a 2. That means there are some trees at the sites starting to break bud. There's still beetles well before that. but it's a very different story when you're looking at the beetles that are going into the wounds. Definitely after leaf out, just a couple at bud break, but then again, when you're looking at that initial bud break, when you have above a rating of 2, that means that there are trees in that stand that they're started to break bud. That's where we see the first few beetles coming into wounds in the trees. When you look at this with growing degree days on the bottom, it's not quite as clear. It's a little bit trickier because the timing and the growing degree days, of course, changes from site to site. So this is just looking at a scale of about 50 degrees growing degree days and that thermal accumulation over time. Again, you can see this big pulse of beetles right as after that initial bud break is happening on trees. We would also see a large pulse if this was by phenophase across at a phenology rating of 6. That means it's leaf out. From full leaf out goes from about 250 to 300 and on for growing degree days here. We also looked at the species that were going into these. The most abundant individual species did change with trap methods, wound age, mean phenophase, and things like this. But if you're looking carefully down this, if you're familiar with any of the species names, Glissoquilus fasciatus was common across all of our traps. These are the top 3 abundant species per trap type here. But there are none at that very beginning when the buds were dormant for our fresh wounds again. So in summary, there's a lot of evidence that we've pulled together, and a lot of that cumulatively is supporting that observation that nidatulids are active for weeks before they're seemingly attractive to wounds or they're going into there, kind of really suggesting that those red oak wounds are much less attractive to nidatulids until after bud break has set in at these stands. Right? Taking that to the next step and trying to model risk based on that. This is just one model output. If you don't pay attention to any of the numbers on there, this is trying to model the likelihood of beetles going into fresh wounds with our environmental models and growing degree days. And if you add phenology to that model, it even improves our growing degree day model, and it makes it even more likely and a better fit to predict the likelihood of risk of beetles entering those wounds. So in summary, we have lots of beetles collected across all trap types, but only 10 different species were found in fresh wounds. That wound visitation and flight of nidatulids does overlap, but it's not identical in northern forests, and we're seeing them active for weeks in flight traps, but they're not going into the wounds until close to or right at that bud break time or after that time period. And we know there's this whole bunch of different environmental things that can influence activity, but including phenology with some growing degree day models could be really a good idea for predicting risk and a more ecological or a more efficient sort of risk prediction that could be warranted to look at refining this in the future in some areas, especially if it's able to help reduce regulatory burden and give you a more specific time period than what we might currently have in some areas. Again, some acknowledgements. I'll leave this slide up here and try to take some questions. Couldn't have done any of this without support from Michigan DNR and the Invasive Species Grant Program and the Forest Health Protection Program with Forest Service. And then there's been a lot of funding in Canada from Natural Resources Canada and Ontario Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry. Lots of supporters, lots of contributors and collaborators that have been helping out as well. So I'll leave that up and take some questions.
All right, great. Thanks, Tara. We don't have time to do the questions live because we are just a couple minutes behind. So I do see there's a good question about the amount of oaks in the stand and a couple things like that. So if you wouldn't mind just hopping into the chat and seeing if you can answer those, that'd be great. So yeah, great. Up next, we have Erica Colbert, lab technician at New York State Department of Environmental Conservation with a nididulid mark and recapture study.
Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yep. Sounds good.
Awesome. All right, hi everybody. My name is Erica Colbert. I'm a lab tech with New York State DEC's Forest Health Research Lab, and I'm here to talk about a cool study we did last spring, sort of our pilot study attempt to mark and recapture nidodulid beetles. So as everyone on this call knows, nidodulid's vector oak wilt, you need the beetles to visit that fresh the spore mat and then collect the spores on them and then visit the fresh oak wound. In New York, we have about 44 species of nidodulids. They're pretty common and everywhere. We catch them in just about every trap that we have, regardless of what lure type is on them. So one thing that we were thinking about is how far do these beetles actually fly on the landscape to help better maybe predict where we should be looking for oak wilt and help inform our sort of radius when we find positive beetle detections. So there's this study that was done in 2000 that sort of looked into this a little bit. It's a flight mill study, which is essentially a beetle carousel, and you attach the beetle to this flexible arm, and they can take off and land whenever they want. And as they fly around, it records laps on a computer, and you can collect a bunch of flight information this way. And so they did this with a couple species of nidodulids, but the one that I'll highlight here is Caplothorax lugubris, since this is one of our vectors in New York. And they found that on average it flies about half a mile, but the max distance that a beetle flew was over 8 miles. So that's the equivalent of 8 miles of laps around that tiny little carousel arm. And the authors of this study say that the beetle, when it stopped flying, it was basically dead. It had flown itself to death. So this study is interesting because it sort of tells us physically how far these beetles are capable of flying. But obviously this is done in a lab and it doesn't take into account any external stimuli from the environment like temperature, weather, olfactory cues, things like that. So we wanted to apply this on a practical landscape level scale and figure out how far nidodulids are actually flying on the landscape with all of those factors present. And we also thought this would be a good opportunity to do some oak wounding and see what species are visiting wounds. So we set up our study in Burnt Rossman Hills State Forest in Schoharie County. We have our release point in the middle, and then we have 3 rings of traps surrounding it. So we used baited funnel traps, we have our wounded oak trees, and we have non-baited intercept traps. And we were concerned that having a lot of rings of traps with pheromones on it really close to the release point would prevent the beetles from dispersing out further than they otherwise would. So we decided to take those 3 innermost rings of traps and break them out of that circle and make a smaller circle off to the side. And that's also why we use the intercept traps in there, just to sort of not make it so pheromone heavy in that area. But the perk of doing it this way too is we get a little more bang for our buck out of our study area because we can, release a beetle in the smaller circle and recapture it in the farther circle and get a farther distance than we otherwise would if it was just one big circle. So step 1 was to collect live beetles, and we did this using our funnel traps, but we just had a dry collection cup, so we didn't put any antifreeze in it. And we would check them every day and bring the beetles back to the lab, and we gave them apple cores and tomatoes, and we found that they really, really like tomatoes, so that was pretty cute. And then we identified them all down to species and assigned different powder colors to them depending on where they would be released from. And throughout our live trapping in the beginning, we weren't catching as many beetles as we were hoping to. So we decided to continue the live trapping throughout our experiment and just have those traps set up across the road and check those every day, bring those back, powder them, and release them the following day. So throughout our experiment, we were constantly releasing freshly powdered beetles into the environment. And similarly, we thought that any beetles that we found on those oak wounds would be perfectly fine beetles that we could also take back and powder and release. So we did that. We just assigned different colors to them. That way, if we did recapture them on a wound again, we knew that they had already visited a wound and we wouldn't be counting them twice. But over the course of the 2-week period, we released a total of 264 beetles, which isn't very many. Unfortunately, the weather that spring was kind of bad. It was pretty rainy and quite cold the whole time. So we think that that impacted beetle flight and activity. We weren't seeing the numbers that we usually see around that time of year. So that was definitely a limiting factor for us. But despite the rainy weather, the beetles had no problem taking off and flying away. We had a pretty nice sunny day when we released them. I will say we did powder them like crazy, so they look a little ridiculous. But we know that that powder is going to rub off a little bit, so we wanted to make sure they were powdered pretty heavily. But they had no problem flying away. We also wounded our trees using the methods that have been described earlier. We used that hole saw drill bit. We plugged up the bark piece to sort of keep the predators out, and we added our little roof to keep them safe from the rain. And in our wounding study, we only found one species, and that is Eupuria corticina. We only caught 4 of them, and none of them had powder on them. Those are in those trees on the map there, those red dots. And this is a species that we've seen before in New York, but it's not one of our really common ones that we collect in our standard funnel trapping. But it has been known that that species visits spore mats in Minnesota and stuff. So we thought that, you know, if they're visiting spore mats and they're also visiting wounds in New York, that this could maybe be a potential vector, or at the very least something that we need to keep our eye on and maybe prioritize this species when we send our nitadulids out to be tested. So now for the trickier part, I'll remind you, when we release the beetles, they look like this. They're completely covered in powder. And when I get them back, they look like this. And it's kind of hard to tell, but I'll highlight it for you. This Glycerchilus sanguinolentis has a tiny, tiny speck of green powder on it. It's really hard to see, especially with the naked eye, but I promise you it's there. And then this Calopterus truncatus has pink powder on the bottom of its feet. It's a little bit easier to see. But then I got a UV light for the microscope, and this powder fluoresces under that light. So when you look at the beetles with the UV light, they just light up, and you can see that there's powder on the bottom of its feet again, but also up underneath its pronotum, and on the upper legs. It's on its face and mandibles. So this beetle is covered in powder, which is wonderful. I think, you know, looking at this Glycerchilus sanguinolentis, it's easy to say like, that might just be like an accident. That doesn't really look like it was powdered to begin with. But this one here, because it has powder head to toe, I got really excited when I found that, because it sort of proves that this worked and that we were able to recapture a beetle. And given that we only released a little over 200, I think the fact that we recaptured even one is a huge win. So that was very exciting to see. So I continued going through the samples, and I started finding powder on a bunch of other nitadulids, and I was pretty happy about that. And then I started finding powder on things that weren't nitadulids, like bark beetles. And I started finding both green and pink powder on the same nitidulid, which shouldn't be possible. So rather than decide to use the presence or absence of powder as like proof that that beetle had been recaptured, we decided to assign confidence scores to these, because clearly there's some contamination happening. So when I went back through and sort of reevaluated all the beetles, I found a Caplothoraxae that traveled about half a mile. That's this red dot right here. So it was released from the larger circle and recaptured in the smaller circle. So that's exciting for 2 reasons. One, we kind of have a distance now for Caplothoraxae, which is exciting. That's information we didn't really have before. But also it sort of proves that our study design worked, and that we were able to recapture a beetle using like the 2-circle system. And then that Calopterus truncatus here is the one from the previous slide. That one didn't go quite as far. It was intercepted in the first ring of traps. So that smaller circle there, but still cool nonetheless. And then some of these beetles didn't have quite as much powder as the high confidence ones, but
still like more than just a tiny little speck. So I assigned some confidence to them. Those are those paler dots and paler lines. And then there were some beetles that just had like a single grain of powder. So we're not sure exactly what was causing that there. So this has been sort of a trickier part of this process that I don't think we were anticipating, was sort of this contamination and like wondering sort of what's going on with the beetles and why the powder is getting mixed on them and rubbing off so easily. And so I think our leading theory is somewhere out on the landscape they're interacting and this powder is being transferred. So I don't know if this is happening in the trap cup. Maybe a beetle that had one powder color on it landed in the trap cup, moved around a bunch. The powder kind of got dislodged from its body, and then when it's poured through our paint filter, it sort of settles on everything else in the sample. Or if, something is landing on our release platform out in the woods that has a little residual powder on it and then winds up in the trap. Or it could be contamination in our lab as I process the samples, even though I try really hard to clean my stuff in between. It's totally possible. So that was definitely a tricky part. I just wanted to highlight that that was sort of the major challenge for us in this project. So lessons learned, obviously obtaining enough live beetles to do a study like this is really important just to increase your odds of recapturing them. But we found that the weather impacted that a lot. It was kind of rainy and cold, so the beetle flight that we were seeing isn't quite what we expected. We also had to try our hand at keeping beetles alive in the lab until we could release them, which is something that we didn't have a ton of experience with, but we found that they were fine for about a week, and then after that they started to get pretty sluggish. But luckily the beetles that we released in our experiment weren't in the lab for more than like 5 or 6 days, I would say, at a time, and most of them were released the very next day as we trapped them throughout, so that was all right. But the biggest thing is finding powder on the beetles. Using that UV light really helped, but the powder rubs off really easily, and the beetles groom themselves a lot. So I would say if we're going to take this and run with this again, doing like a more permanent way to mark them by like painting a small dot on them would be a lot easier, just because dusting them with powder didn't really work out so well for us. So that's all I have. I would be happy to answer any questions and also get any feedback from you guys. We're trying to decide if this is a project we want to redo this year and try to refine the methods. So if anyone has any advice or has any strong opinions about whether or not this is going to be helpful, useful work, I would be happy to hear about it. So thank you very much.
Great presentation, Erica. Looking in the chat, I don't know if we have any questions. I know we got a lot of laughing reactions at your slide. But yeah, mention that we should redo this project this year.
Sounds good.
Yeah, there's a lot of positive feedback here. The flight distances would be extremely useful to figure out. So, yeah, very good, Erica. Thank you very much. And yep, all you folks who are saying we should continue this, I'll take your names down and we'll get you involved in the project for this upcoming year. It was a significant amount of work, but yeah, I think it is that is one of our goals here, is to figure out how we can keep that work up going and be more successful next time. So, keeping us moving forward on to our final presentation of the afternoon. We have Anna Yang, postdoctoral fellow at the Forest Service Northern Research Station, and we're going to hear about some root survival and pathogen persistence in diseased trees. Anna. Excellent. No.
See. Here we go. Okay. Are you seeing my slides?
We can see your slides. Oh, and then, yep, there you're in presenter mode now. Thank you.
Okay, great. I guess I will close out our day here. Hopefully everybody is still with me. There have been so many great talks today. I'll get started so that we don't have to linger around too much longer. But I'm going to share a little bit of work that came out of my thesis a couple of years ago that I haven't really had an opportunity or venue to share, present in yet, where we looked at root survival, pathogen survival, and the interaction between the two of those things. This is a nice abbreviated format to present in. I don't have to give a ton of background about why we did this, but we were in the middle of a vibratory plow experiment a handful of years ago that brought up some questions about how long roots survived in diseased trees, how that affects placement of containment boundaries. And then this all sort of happened around the same time that herbicides were really starting to become a big part of conversations among this group and others. And so I decided to start up a preliminary study in like the middle of an ongoing PhD to address some of these questions. To look at how long roots survive, how long does the fungus survive in those root systems, and then how do those things interact with one another. I did this work in east central Minnesota in Sherburne County. It's very sandy soil, tons of oak wilt. This is a pretty limited experiment, so limited to a single property with a property owner who keeps really awesome records and is very accommodating for oak wilt research. So we selected trees or stumps from trees that had died of oak wilt within a range of time, starting from actively wilting trees to trees that had died up to 5 years previous. A total of 22 trees, an average of about 16 inches basal diameter. We sampled at least 2 roots from each of these trees, but on average was closer to about 6 roots per tree. And I remember before I pitched this project, Jenny Jeswick told me that this was the messiest type of work she's ever done in her career. And she was right. I'm glad that I was really kind of naive going into it. Otherwise, I don't know if I would have done this work, but it is still pretty cool. So this is how we excavated roots in the first year of the study in 2022. It was a pressurized air excavator with a vacuum pump. So we could, bust up the soil while vacuuming up some of the loose soil to expose these roots. It was really, really putsy work. And the owner of the excavation company that I was working with said, why don't we just try this again next year and just pull the whole tree out of the ground? And this is one of my favorite things about working with a variety of folks, because it had never occurred to me that we could just pull the whole tree out of the ground. And so that's what we did in 2023. They brought in an excavator and sort of severed the roots a few feet away from the base of the tree and then pulled the whole thing out of the ground, shook off all the extra soil so that I could just go in with a handheld Sawzall and sample the roots that I wanted. It's pretty awesome. So we took tons of root samples back to the lab. This is me holding a handful of them. We cleaned the roots, we cut them into smaller subsamples. We measured each of the subsamples, kept track of their relative position from the root collar, and then spent several months processing them. We did this processing in 3 parts. The first was fungal culturing to see if the fungus Brachiella pagacearum was still alive in the roots. We collected some wood shavings to do DNA detection. So this was with nested PCR to test for pathogen DNA. And then finally, we did a really quick and dirty redox stain that tells us if the tissues in those roots are still metabolically active. And some of you might recall or recognize the stain process is the same thing that was published by Johan Brun and Linda Haugen in like 2003. So I was basing this work kind of on some of their methods. And so today I'm just going to mostly report on results from the vitality staining and also the fungal culturing. Okay, jumping into vitality staining, root survival. Our staining categories had 3 possible results. The first was the roots were dead, they didn't stain at all. Or the second was they stained like a really subtle pink or fuchsia, indicating that they were kind of still hanging on, but weren't like really obviously alive. And then the third was a bright fuchsia stain that indicated that the tissues were like metabolically very active. So this figure shows the proportion of living roots on the y-axis here and time since tree wilt on the x-axis. And oopsies. And you can see the sort of relative proportion of these samples that were living in actively wilting trees down to trees that were 5 years old. So in actively wilting trees, somewhere just below about 80% of the roots were, root samples were still alive. And then 5 years later, it was closer to about 40%. But I think an important trend here too is that you can see this like relative proportion of this like deeply fuchsia, brightly stained tissue goes down pretty quickly. So the roots are definitely on their way out. For the analysis, I ended up making this stain category binary. So were the roots alive or were they not alive at all? And this figure shows us the proportion of living roots sampled again over time. So kind of similar to the last figure that we looked at, except this data has been made binary. And then we fit a model to it to see if we could predict root survival over time. We tested a handful of variables in this, like tree diameter, or basal diameter, the diameter of the sample, position from the root collar, all to see if any of those things predicted root survival. The things that seemed to be the best fit were time since the tree wilt, and then also that position from the root collar. Moisture content is one that I wish I would have measured and added to this. I think it would have been a really useful predictor, but who knows? From that model, we can tack on a few predicted probabilities to give ourselves like a little bit of predictive power to just get like a, I don't know, some real numbers to look at. How does that percent of root survival change from actively wilting down to 5 years later? All right, moving on to pathogen survival. This is a really similar looking figure. Again, this is modeled like likelihood, where we have the likelihood of pathogen isolation on the y-axis, time since tree wilt on the x-axis, and these black-ish looking dots are our data points. So this is living viable pathogen that's in each of our root subsamples. And so from this, we can see that pathogen survival drops off pretty darn fast in the first couple of years after tree wilt. Again, we tried to fit a handful of variables to see what best explains pathogen survival. But the thing that seems to explain it the most clearly is just time since wilt. Interestingly, I think the relative position from the root collar wasn't significant. I also added the same models that the same variables that we did for root survival, like basal diameter and sample diameter, but none of those were significant either. And again, we can tack on these predicted probabilities to have a little bit more of a concrete number to go with our estimations here. Okay, so root survival decreases over time, pathogen survival decreases over time. The next question is, can we assume that root survival is correlated with pathogen survival? And surprisingly, with our data, the answer was no. We didn't find a significant relationship between the two, which was really surprising to me because in my brain, I always just thought, well, if the roots are dead, the fungus is dead. And I still think that that is actually the case. But if we remember, viability of the fungus decreases really quickly, but survival of the roots kind of like hangs on for a little bit longer. So it turns out that, you know, in year time 0 for actively wilting trees, you have the highest pathogen presence, you have the highest root survival, but then the relationship with the two sort of falls apart after that. So my suspicion, I think, is that this metabolic stain that we're using to say roots are dead, kind of dead, or not dead is just a little too much of a coarse approximation to capture what's really going on with these roots. My suspicion is that there's some sort of physiological shift that we haven't captured where the roots go from being like a really great substrate for this fungus to exist in, to be habitable in, to not being able to persist. We know that this fungus is a really poor saprophyte, so I suspect that there's like a shift that we haven't been able to capture with that stain. So what does this all mean for management? Oh, now we know roots and pathogens survive at least 5 years. We kind of knew this. This has been like, this shows up, this five-year number shows up pretty frequently in what our suspicion is of how long the pathogen stays alive. But I think it, one thing that it has helped us with, especially when it comes to deciding on where to place containment boundaries, it really verifies that we have to account for older dead trees and stumps when establishing containment boundaries. We had worked with a manager who said, that looks like it died a long time ago. We don't need to worry about it when we're dealing with placing our vibratory plow lines. But the fungus could still be alive in the root systems. And so it's really important to, when possible, account for those. The other thing that is kind of a consideration is I think it explains why the 5 to 6 year monitoring period for monitoring treated sites works pretty well, but there are still exceptions sometimes when a handful of years later, then an infection will pop up again. This survival in the root systems could explain why we see that from time to time. But I also think that understanding long-term pathogen survival in the roots is important because when you sever roots using a vibratory plow, at least, trees on the outside of your containment center start putting out new roots right away. This picture here with my little foot in the corner shows root regrowth after 4 years in a site that was treated with a vibratory plow. So these roots are regrowing. I don't know that they are regrafting with trees on the inside of the line or with roots from stumps on the inside of the line, but it is important consideration. So the next step in this work, I think, is kind of tying some of this to herbicide evaluations. And so I want to talk about what this means for herbicide use and how it might inform potential herbicide research. We didn't find a strong link between root survival and pathogen survival, but I want to know if using herbicides can actually shift. I don't know if you can see my mouse, but if it can actually kind of shift this early part of the trend line so that we can decrease both of those things kind of faster. We have a tiny bit of preliminary data that suggests that it might not change root survival. This is a very limited, I don't even want to call it a study. It was just like a little opportunity. When we did this root survival work, there happened to be a handful of trees on this landowner's property that he had treated with a cut stump herbicide treatment. So he harvested the trees and then applied triclopyr plus bark oil to the cut stump right after the trees were felled. It was like 5 trees or something like that. So small sample size, but we tested it 4 years later, and about 40% of the roots were still alive to some extent. These trees didn't produce stump sprouts, but the roots were still alive. And so compelling. The trends that we see here 4 years post herbicide application look somewhat similar to what we saw in diseased trees that hadn't been treated with anything. So we're setting up a pilot study and hopefully a larger trial as well. We're looking at triclopyr and glyphosate, seeing if we can detect it in woody tissue so that we can hopefully make some kind of inference about how herbicide uptake and translocation might correlate with tissue survival. And then the plan is to put together a larger controlled trial with small oak wilt pockets here in Minnesota where we can apply the treatments and test tissues after treatment and monitor sites for 5 years after the treatment. So we had also been hatching a very fun idea to work with other folks on this call in the region to put together more of an operational trial to collect data and have folks do their own individual tissue staining. And that came to a little bit of a halt with the government shutdown last fall, right when everybody was doing their herbicide applications, but hopefully we can pick that up again this year. So this work and other stuff that's in the works in Minnesota is being carried out by this like really amazing team. It's myself, Rebecca Montgomery, who's faculty at the University of Minnesota, Erica Hauser, who's a graduate student with this project, and others, and Grace Haynes, who is our project manager on this. But yeah, I'm happy to take any questions.
They're just looking. Okay, so There is a question. Is there any data on the effects of root grafting of healthy live adjacent oak trees? Oh, it just jumped. Hold on. Healthy live adjacent oak trees with the root systems of oak trees that had died and keeping the root systems of the dead tree alive and maintaining the viability of the fungus.
Oh, that's a long one. Okay, I think I found it in
You
the
might
chat.
want
Let
to
me
read
give
it.
I'm gonna read it over one more time.
I don't think I phrased it right either for maximum understanding. All right.
Okay, so the question is, so I think the question is like, can root systems of dead trees be sort of like held alive by root systems of healthy trees if they're grafted to one another? And I don't really have an answer to that. There's been a little bit of suspicion that maybe that could happen because there is still possibly exchange of nutrients, within those existing grafts, but I don't actually know, and I don't actually know if there's data on it.
Okay. I think that's all. There's a little bit of conversation going back and forth, but I don't see other questions. Am I missing anything, Chris? Okay. Oh, here's one. Anna, is there a paper published with this research yet?
No, I got a backlog, but I'm hoping to put this together as like a short communication with maybe the ISA journal or something like that, just to get the information out before we actually embark on this like broader, more sort of rigorous trial. But it is, I think it's an interesting study, and so I'm hoping to get the info out.
Nice. Thanks. I think that's all on the questions for now.
Great. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
All right, awesome. Well, it's 2:06, and our goal is to wrap up at 2, so I think for like a 4.5 hour long meeting, we did pretty good keeping on schedule. I want to give a big thanks to all of our speakers. We did have 20 speakers today that all volunteered. We didn't have to twist anybody's arm to fill up the schedule, so I really appreciate that. I think we had a great agenda. Again, this meeting was put on by your friendly Oak Wilt committee, who is James Jacobs, myself, Simeon Wright, Heidi Fry, Brian Schwingle, Tom Macy, and Rachel Doobie. And again, if you have any questions, comments, concerns regarding Oak Wilt, just reach out to one of us. You should all have my contact information. I think I emailed everyone on this call. So if you have any questions, let me know. Again, we plan on holding an in-person, hopefully in a year and a half or so. So watch out for more information. And that is the conclusion of our meeting. It was recorded, so everybody should have access to the recording when it's done, and I'll try to save the chat in case anybody has any questions from there. All right, that's it. So everybody have a great rest of your day. Thank you for coming.
Thank you, Rob, for putting such a great meeting together.
No problem.